Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Good, that was effective. One of the things I'd immediately like you to do, since we're talking about an interdependent world here, is to turn off your mobile phone, if you would, because it interferes in an interdependent way with the audio system. My name's Brian Collins. I'm chairing this afternoon's session up until the discussion. And if I can find out how to drive this. But what we're here to talk about is global challenges for the 21st century and how we make sense of the complexity that exists in the interdependent world and how do we make better assessments of it. I had hoped that Sir John Beddington would be available to give this introductory talk. Unfortunately, he is otherwise occupied. As some of you will know, he leaves his post as Government Chief Scientific Advisor in about 5 weeks' time. So he's very graciously allowed me to use some of his slides, which, for those of you who were at the Foundation for Science and Technology event in this building 2 weeks ago, some of you will recognise some of that material, but I have added to it with my own view because what I want to talk about is slightly different. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about, the Foundation for Science and Technology event does actually put all of his slides and his voice online. So if you, after this event, want to hear what he would have said, you can find it on the Foundation website. So what are we talking about when we talk about global challenges for the 21st century? Well, the first thing to worry about, and is that in focus? It doesn't look in focus from here, is what the risk landscape might look like. It's very easy to talk about the risks that are facing the world as a result of our global interdependency. And a number of them are illustrated on here. And in particular, to do with climate change, the effect of climate, the effect of food, the effect of shortage of water. But what is interesting about them is that now we're beginning to see not only are they risks, but also that they can become benefits if we explore how to exploit the phenomena appropriately. But more importantly for today, they are interdependent. This is an interdependency map that shows how some of these factors depend on each other. Again, I'm not expecting you to look at this detail, but it's just to illustrate the sort of complexity that we're now facing, not only in terms of what the risks and benefits are, but that whatever you touch in one place on the planet to optimize what you might think to be the local issue, you'll have an effect somewhere else on the planet, possibly in a different domain. So what someone might do with regard to shipping taxis in some part of the world will have an effect on food supply in some other part of the world, either positively or negatively. And understanding that global interconnectivity and interdependence is one of the factors we're here to talk about. Nationally, we have our own risk register. When I was the Chief Scientific Advisor in two departments, DFT and BIS, we helped create some of these elements. Effusive volcanic eruption wasn't on a risk register until a certain volcano, whose name, if anyone in the room can pronounce it, no, well, there you go. Nor can John Beddington, which I was surprised to hear when he gave this talk, nor can I. Made a big difference to our perception of how important volcanic eruptions might be. Severe space weather has also become something that has affected our thinking about our infrastructure, a topic which some of you know I've been intimately and still am intimately involved in. So a number of these things have crept into this risk register. And indeed, we've managed to put more things in rather than take things out, which is worrisome, because it seems that we are discovering new risks, new uncertainties, new factors which affect whether or not we will maintain our developed society in the way we want it to be for the near future. And this risk register looks ahead 5 years. What's interesting, and one of the challenges, is what's happening over a 20, even 50-year period, and how do we manage anticipating those things which might be important over many decades rather than half a decade. But at the moment, that is not what is being asked for. That doesn't mean to say some communities aren't doing it. Now, as an example of how these sorts of risks have evolved, here's the time history, and this is one of John's slides, showing the development of pandemic flu over the last 120 years. The flu virus is, of course, one of the viruses that mutates quite regularly, and so we're continually having to track the impact. What is different now is the population of the world having gone up hugely, and secondly, the movement of people around the world in large numbers and very rapidly, so that viruses spread extremely quickly, and it becomes a major factor in the epidemiology of viruses. So the important factor there is that actually the vectors which cause these sorts of pandemics to occur have changed in the last 50 years. So we also have to make sure that we understand the context in which these phenomena occur, as well as the actual phenomenon itself, because those things are changing. That was actually true of the eruption of the volcano in Iceland, because we've created civil aviation in Europe since the last one. So in those 30 years since the last major eruption, we had created something which was devastated as a result of the eruption. Should we have seen that coming? Yes, of course we should, but we didn't. There was a lot of soul-searching after the event, and Julia and I sat round a table many times during that period working out, well, why didn't we see that coming? We could talk over a drink about lots of factors why we didn't see it coming. Similarly, we're beginning to see the impact of diseases in animals and plants affecting diseases in humans. We're beginning to see this connectivity between the biology that exists on the planet affecting our food chain and us as organisms. So again, animal and human diseases are beginning to become interdependent in a way that we wouldn't have expected to be the case many years ago. Julia and Jim will talk at great length, because they're experts on the subject, and which I'm not, about the increase in severe weather events and the cost of natural catastrophes. The map at the bottom shows size of the circle is the cost of the natural catastrophe, and you can see not only is that increasing, the cost is going up as well, partly because of increased urbanization, partly because of increased population. Both factors cause increased economic losses. Where are our major reserves of fossil fuels? What are we going to do about trying to shift out of a dependency on fossil fuels to one which is a low-carbon environment, when what we're finding is it's still very easy and cheap to extract the major fossil fuel reserves that we've got, either in coal or in gas, and certainly what we're now discovering possibly in both under the Arctic. So what are going to be the drivers that cause us to get out of the high fossil fuel dependency, and what's that going to do to climate change? So that's an economic, social, political behaviour interaction with the financial markets and the science of energy, on which we are critically dependent. And of course, there's no good saying, well, we'll just turn off all the lights in the developed world, that'll solve the problem, because actually we have to keep the developed world running to fuel the developing world being low carbon. So we're as dependent upon them as they are on us. And then there is an issue of the uncertainty about the future with regard to where those uncertainties come from. Are they intrinsic in the fact that what we're talking about is complex phenomena which intrinsically have unexpected outcomes? Do we not know the model well enough? Do we not have good enough data? And all of these things cause divergence of our predictions in the future to a greater or lesser extent. So again, the delay in the phenomena that we're interested in is caused by a number of uncertainties, and yet we set targets. We set political and legal targets in this country with regard to what we should try and achieve. And Lord Debon, I'm sure in a moment, will mention, as chairman of the Climate Change Committee, his role in making sure that we understand the legal obligations as well as what the science says. Moving away from energy and climate change to food is a map showing where the food security risk, and the red, pink colours show where they are, and they won't come as any surprise to you. But as you can see, a lot of them are in quite heavily populated countries. So we have a problem with regard to our ethics, because if we had major famine, major starvation issues in those countries, especially at the moment when Western economies are not doing particularly well, can we afford to save the people in those countries economically? Well, we're going to have to, because our ethical principles say we should. But actually, that's going to have quite a profound effect on our economic well-being. Now, I'm not trying to say anything unethical in saying that. I'm just saying we need to go through the evaluation of what that actually looks like as those sorts of phenomena hit us, because they surely will. We depend on global supply chains. We depend on warehouses and ports like this functioning effectively. This is just one example of many that I had the privilege of visiting in Asia. They're absolutely awesome in terms of their scale and efficiency, but if their scale, which is the rest of the world is dependent on, is impacted by natural events or by man-made events, we could find all sorts of supply chain problems, which indeed did happen after the earthquake in Japan. It also happens when this sort of accident occurs, much more local, of course, but nevertheless just as catastrophic in terms of affecting supply chains. And at a more local level, we get, particularly in this country, and in other parts of the world where railway systems are absolutely critical for the delivery of raw materials, in Canada and Australia in particular. Now, this is actually in Yorkshire, but nevertheless, these sorts of phenomena can occur. The supply chain suddenly becomes something that is not as resilient as it should be, and our well-being is dependent upon what happens in other parts of the world. It's a global supply chain, let alone what's happening in aviation, which tends not, of course, not to be bulk goods. It tends to be high-value goods or people. And critical people being in the right place at the right time is important, as we discovered again during the Icelandic volcano. So we have this issue that we have multifactorial resilience that we need to understand and analyse. All these factors have to be put in together. You can't just optimise on the legal framework or the technical framework, the environmental. You've got to look at all of them holistically and balance off an assessment of all of the factors. And this is just one example of the sorts of parameters. There's nested sets of parameters behind all of these that you have to worry about in order to deliver a resilient, developed society or help developing societies move into a space which is more resilient for them. I've talked about so far as if I've been talking about nation states, but actually 70% of us in the world live in cities. 70% of our wealth creation is going to move to be in cities. Actually not very many of them, maybe a couple of hundred. So the balance of power, the balance of influence between cities and nation states is going to be an interesting dynamic to watch over the next few decades. The challenges for cities are a little different because of the density. You have high density of everything. It's called why they're there. So we have high density of people, buildings, and we have diversity of all sorts of principles and practices, which is great. We have lots of diversity of means of transport, but high density of transport. We call it congestion or overcrowding, depending on which mode you're on. Have you noticed we use a different word? Don't know why. We have energy consumption issues, which if you look at a heat map of any large area, you'll see huge heat island effects that have positive and negative effects. We have waste that is produced because we pull in a lot of material and we have to export that waste in some sensible way. And we consume a huge amount of water, which of course has to be cleaned. And lastly, and very topically, we also have data and information being generated about how the city works, which in some people's mind is the saviour of how cities can continue to function. But in others actually looks as if it might be surveillance and invading our privacy. Discuss. It's a very topical issue again. It also, of course, cities are attractive for inward migration. And most importantly for today, none of these things operate without being dependent on any of the others. So the city as an organism, as a system of systems, is a very important thing to consider. So I just want to draw a few conclusions, and then we'll have a series of talks about various aspects of what I have tried to give an oversight on. Firstly, and to this audience, this is pretty obvious, that the man-made world and the natural world are richly interdependent and intrinsically complex and should be treated as one system. We need collaboration because no one area, one nation state, one city understands how to not only assess the risks and the opportunities. Remember I said at the beginning, opportunities and benefits can come from understanding this better. And change of all types, and I deliberately use a very general phrase there, that's change that we've made, change that occurs as a result of natural phenomena. We need to understand what the opportunities that come from those changes. But in particular, as we grow in population, because at the moment we don't see any limit to that, and cities become denser, as I've indicated, that looks as if they will do, we have natural events, public health, natural resources, and ubiquitous education, on which I'd not touched before, becoming critical. But are we at the right time to analyse that? Have we now got a set of tools that if I'd stood up and talked about this 10 years ago, you'd have said, no, we don't have any means of doing any of this. We don't have the right tools, we don't have the understanding, we don't have the data. are we now at a tipping point of actually we do have most of the right tools, we do have a lot of the right data, and we probably have a political and a governance understanding across most of the planet that this is the next 20 years when we're going to make real headway into cracking this type of problem. So is this now the right time to start taking a global view on this type of issue, which it wouldn't have been 10, 20 years ago, and in 10, 20 years' time, it's probably too late, because some of these factors are driven by natural phenomena. So is this an issue of its time? And that's what one of the things, at least, I think we'd be very interested in hearing a debate about later. So this is a seminal image for someone of my generation. I watched this live on black and white television on Boxing Day, Earthrise, when the Apollo 8 mission was going around the moon. And for me, seeing that, which I was on, was actually a shivering experience, and it still is, even just talking about it. And that's what we're talking about here, is preservation of us on the planet. Thank you very much. That's where I'd like to stop. I'll now pass over to Lord Devon, who's going to talk to us a little bit about his experience in UK climate change assessments.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for asking me, and I'd rather like to start by saying that I'm really going to talk a bit about risk, because one of the things that we have in common on all those issues that we've been talking about is the assessment of risk and an attempt to decide how you organise your life to deal with risk. And I want to suggest, first of all, that we all live our lives in this way. Sometimes we elevate these issues as if they are enormously difficult because, of course, we choose very, very big issues. I want to just think about our own way of living our own life. If you decide to buy a house, you will look at the circumstances of buying the house. You'll say, am I likely to keep my job? So will I want to go on living here, and can I pay the mortgage? And you'll say, will my children be able to go to the right school? And you'll say, will there be a commuter train that will enable me to get to my office? And you'll come to the conclusion that, in general, those three things will be okay. You'll look at them quite carefully to see. But you will not be certain. Because anyone can lose their job. Anyone can find that the school deteriorates. Anyone can discover that Virgin Rail decides not to run that particular that particular train service. But you proceed by buying the house. You don't say, because it's not absolutely certain, I won't buy the house. You couldn't live your life on that basis. And so I start by saying that even these very big issues, you've got to start by how do human beings themselves make their own lives, organise themselves. The second thing that's true is that not only do you take risks, there are other risks you take in your stride. There are 27 million homes in Britain, most of them insured against fire. But only 60,000 will have a fire. So I suppose you could say, well, I've got 439 opportunities out of 450 or whatever, 439 out of 440 of not having a fire. So why do I insure against that risk? I do it because the size of the risk in respect to my life is so great that I can't accept that as one of the risks. That's how I deal with it in my own life. And the third way we deal with risk is to recognise what we're prepared to run with. And of course we're very peculiar about that as human beings. 50% of regular smokers will die of a smoking-related disease. It's surprising how anybody takes that risk at all, because it's a 1 in 2 risk. But there are lots of other risks which we're not prepared to take, which are much bigger than those. It's a very odd way in which we as human beings try to deal with the issue of risk in our lives. So when we come to talk about climate change, the thing I want to start with is by saying there isn't any difference between the calculations which we ought to be making and the calculations we make as to whether we buy a house or not, which is, after all, the biggest personal financial decision that almost everybody in this world, this country, will ever take. So we have to say that the risk of climate change is not a far-off one. It's an immediate one. It's not an unlikely one. It is very likely indeed. And it is not one that can easily be managed. It is going to be difficult to manage, and it's not one that necessarily works in a linear way. It could easily become very much worse and even more difficult to manage if we take the best science that's around. So it's perfectly sensible in such a circumstance to say, I have to manage that risk, and I have to manage it immediately, because there is a real additional risk that it will be more difficult and more expensive to manage later on. And I also have to accept that it will not be easy and that it will probably be inconvenient for large numbers of people. So why is it that it's so difficult to get people to sign up to dealing with a risk like that? And it's here that I have to say that I have a great deal of sympathy with Lord May in a recent speech that he made in Australia. I think we have allowed ourselves to dignify those who will not accept this risk as sceptics. They are not sceptics. They are deniers. Scientists are sceptics. I'm a sceptic. I look at the evidence, try to make a decision as to what the evidence shows and what is the best that I can make of that evidence. That's not what those who wish us not to take this risk seriously actually say. What do they say? They say man-made climate change is not yet certain. While there is doubt, it is better not to act because we may not need to act at all. To act now will be expensive and make us uncompetitive. In any case, it's inconvenient, our readers and our voters won't like it, and other people and countries are not doing anything. Better to wait until we're sure, and then the market will do everything. And they'll do it cheaper, it'll do it cheaper and more effectively. Besides, something may turn up, and scientists will invent something that will solve the problem much more painlessly, and something which we haven't even thought of yet. That's, roughly speaking, what they're saying. It is procrastination erected into a political philosophy. It's a determination to avoid making decisions. And behind it, of course, there are some dark forces. I don't want to go into them, but there are some dark forces, large sums of money, and an operation which is akin to trying to make people believe that tobacco and lung cancer were unconnected. It's a technique which has long been used, and it's being used this very day in this way. Don't actually confront the issue, but undermine the people who are confronting the issue, because you know you're not going to win the argument. So we're faced with people who want to do that, and they have behind them a number of things we have to recognise, those of us who want action. First of all, they have a curious view that not acting is different in kind from acting. And we have to remind people that acting and not acting are in that sense the same thing. They both have consequences. If you don't act, then you will in fact have consequences. The feeling behind those who want us not to act on climate change is that somehow or other, if you don't do it, you'll be better off, and it's not the same kind of decision. And of course, that's not true. If you don't act, you are first of all assuming a linear approach to the problem, i.e. that if you don't act today, then tomorrow it'll be just a bit more difficult, but not a huge amount of difficult. They don't think of it as we should, which is much more akin, as a former minister of fisheries, I can say this, much more akin to the problem with fish, which is that you have a decline in the fish, and then suddenly, for reasons we don't understand, it suddenly drops like that, so that it isn't linear at all. Now, we are in exactly that position, we think, with climate change. I can't swear to you that in all circumstances, climate change is absolutely proven, nor can I swear to you that it is absolutely non-linear. All I can say, as I would if I were buying my house, is that that is the most likely way for these things to go. And therefore, if I am a rational human being, I ought to take the most likely route. But behind it also is another approach to risk, which worries me perhaps more than any other. And it's this, that if you don't know for certain, you're better off taking any view you like. That somehow or other there is something improper about trying to take the best view. And it's an all-pervasive view, particularly on the right of the political spectrum. The very far right, the Tea Party right in Britain and the United States. And yes, we've got them in Britain, and they're as unpleasant here as they are in the United States. And the far right has this view somehow or other that because it isn't the market doing it, you shouldn't do it at all. Now, the problem with that is that they don't understand the market. I'm a great believer in the market, but I think you have to understand what the market is. The market is an immediate way of making decisions about what people want, about how you use resources. But it's immediate. It has no time dimension at all. And that every government has got to step in and say, the market is very good, but you can't allow it to be totally in command, because otherwise it will never tell you whether you're running out of resources. It will never tell you whether you're going to be stuck with not having particular resources for particular needs in 20 years' time, because that's not what it's good at. Mrs. Thatcher, curious enough, understood that perfectly well. Never got that wrong, which is why she was so strong a supporter of the battle against climate change. She recognised that you couldn't use the market for the wrong purposes. But of course it's a very convenient thing for the procrastinators, because it says, when it comes to it, the market will sort it out. Well, it won't if temperatures have risen by 4 degrees, actually, because it won't be in a position to sort anything much out. And that's why we have to be very serious. And if it's risen by 5 degrees or 6 degrees, then the market will be a long-lost phenomenon, because many other things will have stepped in to operate in the world in which we live. So behind the concept of climate change scepticism is an attitude which is itself unacceptable, unscientific, and not sceptical. It is exactly what those who hold it claim others do, which is that it is prejudged. It is a prejudice. What it does is to look with scepticism on any argument with which they disagree, and accept with alacrity and no scepticism any argument that seems to support their theory. Now, I have concentrated on that rather than to go through the purposes and the activities of the Climate Change Committee. I've done so because we in Britain have got a statutory requirement to deliver by the year 2050 an 80% reduction in our emissions on the year 1990. That is the law. I am put in charge of a committee which has to deliver that. We have to produce the targets and the budgets to make that possible, and we take the view that you have to do that on a sensible and orderly manner. I do that because I'm a businessman. I can't think of anything stupider than leaving everything until the last moment, because you don't actually then run a successful business. So it is a perfectly boringly practical activity. You do, in a sensible, orderly manner, the process which will deliver that, and you do it as cost effectively as it is possible to do. Our difficulty is that that is not the argument. The argument is an argument of unequals. It's an argument of innuendo. It's an argument which tries to undermine ad hominem rather than argue the case, and it's an argument that increasingly is designed to spread doubt. And we who are concerned with the scientific community, either as scientists or that much more difficult thing as politicians and policymakers trying to use science and to use it properly, we have to face that issue, that the creation of doubt by mechanisms which are now sophisticated beyond anything, the creation of doubt is the process by which science is being undermined. And I end with a very simple and totally different example, just to show how broad is this problem. A distinguished associate professor at the University of Texas at Austin produced, after a good deal of research, a paper which was peer-reviewed and published in a sociological and very well-respected sociological learned journal. And he investigated the effect of having a single-sex parents on children. And he discovered that there were disadvantages. Now, I speak as someone who's going to vote in favour of gay marriage, so I'm not in any way biased on this. But he, as a scientist, produced some real evidence that there were problems. And this so annoyed the extreme gay community that, first of all, they tried to undermine him as a person, then they tried to undermine the magazine, then they tried to attack the editor for accepting the article, then they got the university to investigate him on the grounds that he was behaving in a non-scholarly way. Now, happily, the university has a sort of double system of investigation. The first is to investigate whether an investigation is necessary. And that showed that he was utterly without reproach. I use the example because, let's face it, that is how our opponents are going to behave right across the board. I won't mention the newspapers because they probably aren't ones that you read. But the popular newspapers on weekdays and Sundays are filled with articles which are designed not to argue the case, but to say this scientist, of course, would say that, wouldn't he, because he is in an institution which has got money from the government to do this research. This politician is on that side because he has got commercial interests. This individual thinks like that because actually he's got a religious or a social or a political position which undermines what he has to say. Never argue the case. Always destroy the individual or the standing of the institution. So I believe that today we have to recognise that we are dealing with doubt in a world which demands certainty. We are dealing with doubt in a world which thinks that if you dare to suggest you will continue to be critical when you've made your interim decisions, that somehow or other you're undermining your very case. Above all, we're dealing with doubt in a world which would prefer certainty because it does not actually want to act and thinks that by demanding certainty, it can in fact ensure inaction. That's why procrastination is our biggest enemy, and those who support procrastination use their money, their time, and their enthusiasm not to argue the case, but to undermine those who seek to protect us from what is the biggest physical threat the world has faced in its history.
Well, Devon, thank you very much for that. Unfortunately, I think you said you have to leave almost immediately to carry out other duties, such as voting in a democracy, which is also an extremely important factor in our lives. I'd now like to introduce Professor Jim Hall from Oxford, who's going to talk to us about system science and engineering for responding to global change. Close that down and go back to the desktop.
Here we are. Brilliant, thanks. I'm not quite sure how I follow that one, but thanks very much, really, to Lord Deben for drawing attention so frankly to the politics of the situation we find ourselves in now, and also to casting this discussion in terms of risk, which is very much the terminology that I'm going to use as well. And thanks to Brian for setting out the context of processes of global change which we're seeking to respond to in global systems, science and engineering. Brian used some of John Beddington's slides, and I'm going to use another one from the talk which he gave at the here at the Royal Society a couple of weeks ago, where, as well as casting his tenure as chief scientist in terms of the perfect storm of convergent global megatrends of resource scarcity and energy, food, water, and climate change, biodiversity collapse, John has very practically and constructively drawn attention to the contributions which science and engineering can make to responding to these changes. In the talk at the Royal Society, he referred to this article here in The Economist, which many of you will have seen, which questions, well, actually draws attention to a number of sources of evidence that the rate of innovation has slowed down in the 21st century compared to the middle and the latter part of the 20th century. And there's a lot of debate around that, of course. But one of the points made in that article was that as science pushes back the frontier, it takes longer for scientists and specialists to reach that frontier and then innovate further, which is a version of Ralph Sockman's aphorism that the larger our island of knowledge grows, the longer the shoreline of wonder. And what concerns me is not necessarily the length of the shoreline, or indeed the amount of time it takes us to get there, but the area of that island of knowledge that somehow we need to synthesize, at least in part, if we're going to make sense of the perfect storm. And the process by which we learn, by which we harness collective capabilities to do science in this very complex setting is what I'd like to address in this talk primarily. But what also concerns me, and I think this is very much what concerns Lord Deben, is our capacity to influence the processes of change that are taking place. What concerns me is that that processes of global environmental change have an internal dynamic, in my more gloomy moments I'd even say inevitability to them, some of which is benign. So processes, for example, of reducing fertility, associated with increasing wealth and female education, but also malign, and in that context, consumption of common pool resources. And those processes seem to have an inevitability which we sometimes, in the sense Lord Deben was referring to, struggle to control over. Big environmental science, and I cast my mind back to the Planet Under Pressure conference and Rio +20, which followed it, to my mind exists to a far too great extent in a world of its own, without recognizing the political economy of the situation we find ourselves in globally, and particularly in relation to fiscal imbalances, shifting global balance of power, and the functioning of the globalized economy. In June of last year, Chris Llewellyn-Smith, who will speak in a moment, Charles Godfrey, John Beddington's predecessor, Dave King, and I were involved in organising a conference in Oxford called Resource 2012, which was an interesting experience for a number of senses which I won't go into. But the discourse was quite different in the sense that it brought together
investors, multinationals, governments, a spattering of academics. And the points of common ground which I identified between that investor community and the scientific community, and here again I resonate with Lord Deben, was first of all in terms of the language and methodology of risk, and the way in which risk has a great deal of traction in the boardroom and in the government department, as well as in the scientific methodologies that I work on. And the second was in the need to provide methodology and tools to think about the long term and think rationally about decision making under uncertainty. And that, once again, is very much the point which Lord Deben was seeking to make. So in my own area of water, I make a lot more progress, not by intoning the terminology of integrated water resource management, which tends to be confronted with a fairly blank face by anyone other than the connoisseur, but by talking about risks of floods, droughts, harmful water quality, and the ways in which that can impact upon supply chains, as Brian was saying, on consumers, on business operations. Societies are continuously kind of recalibrating the tolerable level of risk at which they operate. And that happens in haphazard ways, usually in response to extreme events. But that's not the most rational or indeed the fairest way of managing risks. But I think in the context of flooding, we've actually got the message across in that sense. So this is work which, based on work which we did perhaps 10 years ago, for the first time looking at national assessment of flood risk. That then found its way into the government's Foresight Future Flooding Programme, which was looking at the ways in which risks change in this country in response to both climate change and socioeconomic change. And that's become quite embedded in the way in which decisions are now made around allocation of flood risk management resources in this country. We're now working on demonstrating how decision-making around water resources planning can be taken from basically its rather deterministic framework at the moment to an arrangement which looks much more explicitly at the probability of sets of harmful outcomes and the effectiveness of different management options in reducing those probabilities. But we're also becoming acutely aware of the ways in which those basin-level water resources decisions are embedded in the global context. So the picture on the right there, it's too small to see, but what we look, the vertical axis there is the percentage dependence on water imports. And the red circled entity up there is actually the United Kingdom, which is up there in the top 10 alongside a bunch of countries, mostly in the Middle East, but also including Switzerland and the Netherlands, which are highly dependent on water imports. And the picture below depicts some of the global trade in virtual water. And so that system actually, in many respects, is a very effective way of buffering local water insecurity and substituting for that insecurity with global trade. But on the other hand, it's quite a fragile system because it's fragile to the possibility of correlated drought. And work we're doing now with the Centre for Ecology and Hydrology is looking at the probability of correlated food scarcity and then re-examining water resources decision-making at a local scale to see how we can embed local water security within that global context. Short-termism in investment, in the management of firms, in government is the greatest single barrier, I think, to the transition to sustainability. Part of that problem is in the incentive structures, in remuneration packages, in the electoral cycle. But in part, I think it's because of the lack of analysis capability to actually analyse and think in the long term. Possibly the most important instance of long-term decision-making is national infrastructure systems, which is something which I've been working on for some time now. And that's the choices being made now with respect to national infrastructure are absolutely fundamental with respect to resource consumption, greenhouse gas emissions, vulnerability to natural hazards in the future. So this year, a great deal of progress is being made. For the first time, we have a national infrastructure plan, and the work behind is showing work looking at the pipeline of future projects coming into the UK. So Infrastructure UK and others are making important steps in the right direction, but what I think is recognised is the need for a longer-term vision with respect to infrastructure provision. And the reason that, one of the reasons that doesn't exist is because of the complexity of the analysis problem. And that's one of the things which I and other people, including Brian in this room, have been working on in order to develop that analysis capability so that we can rationally look at sets of long-term plans and see how they will perform in a range of different futures. This depicts the arrangement which we're piloting at the moment, where we combine understanding of long-term demographic change with regional economic modelling, and then understand what the implications of that is for a range of different infrastructure sectors. Here we're looking at the water sector and prospects for declining supply and increasing demand. And that's put together in an analysis package which explores a very wide range of uncertainties and then shows what that means with respect to performance of a number of different infrastructure options. Another instance of where long-term decision-making is needed and needs to be informed by science is on the coast. This is a place, and at this moment I think I'm rather pleased that Lord Deben has left the room because he's been an activist on this part of the coast in relation to the long-term sustainability of coastal protection. And this is where the economics and the environment points in one direction and the politics actually points in quite the opposite direction. And what's required is the analysis which helps to understand the way in which those things fit together and actually presents the evidence for what the future holds on the coast. And that's what we've been doing first via the Tyndall Centre for Climate Change Research and latterly with NERC funding, looking at what's happened in the past on the coast, so validating our hindcasts of coastal change, and then pushing that forwards into the future to look at what the implications of different coastal management strategies are, and then using that information to engage decision makers, thinking realistically about what the future holds, but also what the associated uncertainties are. That is that issue of uncertainty surrounding future changes, which, as Lord Deben said, can be taken as a pretext for inaction. One of the pleasing aspects of policy analysis over recent years has been the extent to which methodology for thinking about severe uncertainties has become part of the mainstream. When I started working on random sets and imprecise probabilities, it was very much part of the lunatic fringe. But now, thanks to people like Rob Lempert and colleagues, Stefan Halgat at the World Bank, Yakov Ben-Haim, who's worked on infogap analysis, and the Treasury's introduction of real options analysis in their adaptation guidance. These types of methodology for rationally thinking about the way in which we make decisions under uncertainty have become really quite widely adopted. And that's fed into thinking about adaptation pathways. So how do we navigate through an uncertain future, making the case, and there is a rational business case in many instances, for keeping one's options open in the short term while we acquire more information in the long term. The picture on the right is work we did with the adaptation subcommittee, looking at different decision pathways for water resource management in the Thames Basin, and demonstrating that actually what you might think about doing in the long term has a very important influence on the choices that you're about to make now in the relatively short term. The approaches that I've referred to, and I've seen a fair amount of nodding going on, will be instinctive to many of the people in this room. I mean, this is a self-selecting audience, of course, mostly. In fact, the examples will be familiar to many people here, and a number of people have actually had a hand in them. And that, in a sense, reflects the nature of this scientific process as well, is that a lot of what we're talking about is done in large, collaborative, often international teams. It inevitably involves working in interdisciplinary teams. The infrastructure consortium I referred to has 7 universities and 12 PIs and 25 postdocs. Chris Llewellyn and Smith will refer in a moment to collaborations which are 2 or 3 orders of magnitude larger in size. So the question is, how do we go about managing these interdisciplinary collaborations? And one of the important messages there, I think, is the way in which orientating towards the problems confronted by decision makers is the stimulus for interdisciplinarity. The types of problems raised by the perfect storm, if you like, require science, engineering, economics, social sciences. Science can't respond spontaneously to the questions which are posed, so we have to enter into relationships of co-production where we're looking ahead with decision makers and strategically building capacity to address the questions which are coming up. We need to experiment. I'd commend the research councils, in particular PSRC actually, for investment and experimentation which has taken place in this space. But at the same time, I think we need to recognise that in this area of science, as with many others, and indeed in all others, and in this area perhaps more so, there's good science and bad science. And just because work is interdisciplinary, there's no reason for not filtering out the bad science. We need benchmarks against which we can demonstrate ourselves. But let me not end on a negative note here. What I've tried to sketch out is an approach which involves analysis of coupled human and natural systems at multiple scales, connects directly with decision making through the analysis of risks and options for responding to those risks, and is explicit about uncertainties but doesn't regard them as a pretext for inaction. As I say, it operates at multiple scales, but it's embedded within the global context, and it provides the tools for thinking about, for adapting to uncertain futures. And navigating the perfect storm is going to be an unsettling experience. But the capacity we have to inform those choices, I think, is hugely underutilized. And in part, that's because for the time being, it's not yet fit for purpose. And so sorting that out is a project for all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. A bit closer even than Jim's talk to the practicality, I'd now like to introduce Julia Stingo, Chief Scientist at the Met Office, who will tell us about climate services.
Thank you very much. Right. First test is to sort this out. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to speak to you today. And I should say, first of all, that I am one of those people that John Gummer talked about who's receiving personal attention from the deniers, and it's not pleasant. But anyway, what I wanted to cover this afternoon was how we're taking now climate science through to climate services, and in a sense getting ourselves in a better place to address all the sorts of problems that we've heard about already this afternoon, and really taking what we've learned from operating weather services for several decades and increasingly having to operate those services in terms of a risk-based environment and allowing people to make decisions, how we can actually move to the same sort of area in climate services. I will say climate services will be much, much more challenging than weather services for all sorts of reasons, not least because we're one relatively small part of what I see as an incredibly long food chain that takes you out finally to the decision that you need to make, for all the reasons that Jim talked about just now. So why do we need climate services? Well, of course, climate change is taking us into uncharted territory. There's no doubt about that. It's a very long time since the planet will have been in the sort of climate that we may take it in the next few decades. And even then, the rapidity of change was nothing like the rapidity of change that we're seeing now, which is preventing basic natural systems to adjust to the change that we're imposing on them. So we do need to provide society with a roadmap indicating what sort of climate changes may occur, where and with what implications, and indeed when. And how should we mitigate and adapt to those, the worst of those impacts. But it's not actually just as simple as about talking about future climate change. And I think for many of us, we got sort of to think only about the 2080s, the end of the 21st century. But the fact is that weather and climate are already having very dramatic impacts now. And this is just a very typical graph that we see of the number of climate-related disasters and the damages from climate-related disasters. Note it only runs up to 2009. If you added on that Hurricane Sandy or the floods, the UK floods, the US droughts, etc., these peaks would be very large. And note that even for the decade that Allianz looked at a couple of years ago, the estimated annual damage could reach $80 to $120 billion. And alongside that are some also personal loss of lives and livelihoods, which we should care about, as well as the economic impacts. So we are already feeling climate and weather, whether it's climate change or not. We can debate that. But as John Gummer said, if you take a precautionary principle to approach to this, you would certainly be thinking, I should take note and start thinking more seriously about this. So what's climate services? Well, it is a revolution in the application of climate science. In October last year, the World Meteorological Organization set up the Global Framework for Climate Services. That came out of the World Climate Conference 3. The previous two had established the IPCC and the Global Climate Observing System. So this is a major, major implementation activity that all nations will engage with in the coming years. And what's it about? Well, it's taking us, I think, from climate change science, which has been largely about proving that the world is warming and that we're responsible and we should do something about it, taking us from mitigation to mitigation, adaptation, resilience and preparedness. Lots of words there, but these are the words that are typically used these days. From few to many customers, users, stakeholders. Away from saying the global temperature rise will be 2 degrees, 4 degrees, 6 degrees, to saying something about regional predictions days to decades ahead. It's talking not just about climate change, but climate change and natural climate variability. That's the natural climate variability we're already exposed to. And taking us away from broad climate to characteristics of weather, including extremes and their impacts. That's how most of us will feel climate change in the future is through the frequency and intensity of hazardous weather. And it's moving into this area of operational delivery where we have regularly updated monitoring forecast products and services. So this is a very big move. We shall be launching the Climate Service UK in the next couple of months in partnership with the Natural Environment Research Council and the Environment Agency in the first instance. And will be a very big initiative, I think, for the UK to tackle the problem of not just climate change, but how climate now affects our everyday lives. As we've already seen, we have to factor in a shifting landscape of risk, changing exposure, changing vulnerability, growing population, and on top of that now, a changing climate. So when we talk about climate services, we have to think of it in the round and not just about the climate problem itself. And also, we live in an uncertain world, and again, we've heard about this. And you could say that weather and climate science has embraced this over the last few decades. Ed Lorentz, one flap of a seagull's wing may forever change the future course of the weather. We work in probabilistic forecasting from even now a few hours ahead right out to the end of the century. So we're well versed in this idea of probabilities and confidence, robustness. I do think there is perhaps a need for a change in language to move away from this word uncertainty to probabilities and robustness, confidence, reliability. Much more positive language that doesn't imply to the man or woman in the street that you don't know something, because actually there's a lot we do know. That's just a little plug, something we might want to think about. There's also, I believe, a sense of urgency in all of this. We can't sit around and assume that nothing will happen till 2050 or 2080, which many of the deniers would like us to do. But already we think that natural variations compounded by global warming may be giving unprecedented extremes. And here's just a few that we've seen in the last couple of years or so. Here's one very close to home. I think 2012 was certainly a bit of a shock for the UK. We had actually average annual rainfall, but you wouldn't have known it to see what we faced in the first 3 months, devastating drought, followed up by then devastating floods, from which we have still to recover in some parts of the world. Coming through Somerset this morning, still many, many fields absolutely underwater, despite the fact it hasn't rained for a little while. And here's something that we published at the beginning of the year, very tentative results, but nevertheless, this is looking at extreme daily rainfall. So this is the 1 in 100-day event across the country, and there's a lot of year-to-year variability. Of course there is. Our weather patterns change from year to year, but there's a sense here that when it does rain, it rains more, or these 100-day events are now becoming 1 in 75-day events. We see this in other parts of the world quite robustly, actually, and in places like India and China, entirely consistent with fundamental physics, and entirely consistent with the increase in surface flooding, flash flooding, that we've seen this past year, rather than river flooding. There has been river flooding, but a lot of the damage has been done by flash flooding. Here's another one. The other side, across the Atlantic, the other extreme, we were flooded. The US had a major drought in 2011-12. Texas had something that was quite unprecedented. The graph you can see on the left shows the summer rainfall against the summer temperature. And as you would expect in summer, when it's drier, it gets hotter. Quite simple. Less soil moisture doesn't allow the ground to sweat so much, it gets hotter. That's 100 years of data shown in that graph, and 2011 is outside the pack by a long way. We're seeing this in other parts of the world. Australian wildfires, their temperatures very, very extreme. How much more do we need to think that there's something perhaps going on here that we should be worried about? I want to just do a little step sideways now and say why I do believe that actually, at least from my side of the science, I think we're at a tipping point in the terms of the sophistication and the complex and the way in which we can deal with complex problems. And that's because I think at long last we're in a position where we can bridge the scales. This is actually our operational forecasting system as currently. The reason I'm showing this is that this is capability that we have in weather forecasting, and indeed capability that could so easily be taken out into the climate prediction. We have now global models that really represent weather systems. They can do blocking anticyclones, they can do frontal systems, they can do monsoons and things like that. But more importantly, we've now got the technology where we can zoom in and get right down to 1.5 kilometres now. We run regularly several times a day over the UK to produce our forecasts, and these models can be relocated rapidly to anywhere in the world. So suddenly you can go from the weather resolving scale down to the cloud system resolving scale. Does that make a difference? Well, I think it does. Here's the southwest floods, where we issued a red alert, 2 images. One is observations and one is the model. Anyone want to guess which is which? It might be, if you've got good eyesight, you can probably guess. But actually, it's the one with the isobars on the far side is the model. And this is what we're running now every day in weather forecasting, and even now in our ensemble of these sorts of models, so we can get at probabilities of convective cells forming in the next few hours over particular locations. That's a remarkable forecast, and on the basis of that we issued a red alert for the southwest for flooding. And I was supposed to be going to the Exeter University Vice-Chancellor's garden party that day. Needless to say, I didn't get away out of my home in Sydney because I listened and I heard red alert and I thought, yeah, he'll have to manage without me. But the point about showing that is that there's remarkable capability that now exists in our models to really get down to this very local detail and really get the intensity of the rainfall. And I talked about extreme daily rates. And so we're now at, I think, this place where we can start to talk about integrated environmental prediction at regional and local scales, where one can actually bridge the gap between between our hydraulic and ecosystem models. For example, we can look at coastal environments in much more detail. We can couple the coastal ocean, the waves and the atmosphere together. For the Olympics over Weymouth Bay, we ran a 333-metre atmosphere coupled to a 250-metre wave model. And the sailing teams thought this was the best thing they'd ever seen. It was incredibly useful. Capabilities there for much greater integration, because at long last the modelling scales are converging. And likewise, we're building, I think, in a very structured way now, our Earth system models, and we're about to embark on a new programme with NERC to build the next generation Earth system model. And it's here that you can actually start to look at this interconnected multidisciplinary world and understand the interactions and feedbacks, not just about the natural system, but about what we're doing to the natural system. And many of the things that we're interested in, like food security and water security, are fully integrated within the Earth system. They feed back on the climate system. So we can't see these things as separate functions. So we do have to look at this in a much more integrated way. And I think at long last we have the models and the modelling frameworks to start to do that. I wanted to finish off by just showing a schematic. This is one I showed a couple of years ago at AGU, where I've tried to look, at least from my perspective, of how well we do things. And I think that actually scientifically, certainly on weather and climate extremes, we're really quite now scientifically sophisticated. And we understand the probabilistic framework and how to do that. I think a lot of what holds us back is raw supercomputing power. Likewise, I think we know a lot about biophysical hazards that link to weather and climate. Weather and climate is not very often the actual impact we feel. It's often mediated through other parts of the system. I think wind is the only example actually where you don't involve some other part of the system. And I've colour-coded where I think we're good, we have a lot of knowledge and where the linkages are poor, and you can see the scale of the challenge here. That there are many of these where I think we have masses of work still to do, but we're beginning to do it. And as we develop this, of course, we have to do this in a probabilistic framework in all areas, not just in the weather and climate extremes, which we do in a very, I think, sophisticated way, but also all these other elements of the pathway. And one of the ways in which we're starting to do that in the UK is through this natural hazard partnership. We talked about the National Risk Register. That was constructed and reviewed by this partnership. It's unique, I think, in the world. It's now formal links between all these agencies who work together. We have a hazard centre now in the Met Office in Exeter, so that we actually talk not just about the weather, but its impacts on the road system, its impacts on land stability. We do forecasts now of landslides and so on and so forth. We've talked about volcanic ash and we've talked about flooding. So I think the way forward as we develop the climate service concept is that we have to think about this in terms of this increasingly complex science, modelling and prediction systems, increasingly complex user requirements, requiring, as Jim rightly said, multidisciplinary and multi-scale approaches. We need partnerships in science and delivery. I think that's absolutely essential. I've sat in a lot of meetings recently around disaster risk reduction, humanitarian emergencies, where we see time after time risk assessments, but where's the action? And the action must be about really getting together and taking science through to delivery. And of course, at the end of it all, you must talk to the end user. It's so often that we produce products and services that actually don't really solve the problem for the person who's got to make the decision. So it's that dialogue that's so essential. So thank you very much. Thank you.
We're now going to move from a national view that Julie's just given to an international view. Professor Sir Chris Llewellyn-Smith, who I'm sure is known to a lot of you in the room, is going to talk about the value of international collaboration.
If I can find my talk.
I'm sure that won't get in your way, Chris.
Okay. Here we are. Okay, thank you, Brian. So, international scientific collaboration is becoming easier thanks to the invention of the World Wide Web, more recently things like Skype, the reduction in the 80s of the cost of air travel, and it's increasing. If we look at scientific publications between 1996 and 2008, the total number of peer-reviewed papers in science and social science, with at least the abstract in English, went up about 75%. And out of that increasing total, the fraction done in international collaboration went from 25% to 35%. So the numbers of papers written in international collaboration more than doubled, nearly 2.5 times up. As scientists using the web, Skype, etc., sought out the best collaborators and facilities wherever they were located. There is some evidence that collaboration leads to better science. If we look here vertically, that's the number of citations per paper, and this is the number of countries involved. So these are just one country. These are papers involving collaborators from 4 countries. And you can see a paper just written in the UK, say, gets 3.5 citations. But if it's written with people in 3 countries, it's up here at 7. Now, that may be because if Brits only cite Brits and Americans only cite Americans, if I collaborate with Americans, I've got more chance of being cited. But I think it's pretty impressive, this increase. I personally think it's more than that, though it'd be really interesting to know who is citing whom. So it does look as if collaboration produces better science, and maybe because better scientists find it easier to find better collaborators. International collaboration is essential while studying many problems that cross boundaries and seeking consensus on the solutions. If we think about, if we want to think about the effects of air pollution or acid rain, we need data from a whole region, many countries, unless we're in the United States, in Europe anyway. If we want to understand the impact of the EU directive on biofuels, then we've got to know something about the conditions in which palm oil is produced out there in the Far East, and so on. Now, linked problems with global impacts, and I've listed them here and they've all already been mentioned, I think, need integrated global approaches for reasons that have been mentioned already, and I've mentioned some of them. Other reasons are the desirability of combining the best talents from around the world to tackle these problems, and the need to involve scientists from many countries in developing the solutions if we want governments across the world to buy into the solutions. It's really important. Science and social science, as well as physical science, is crucial in measuring and predicting the impacts, identifying the solutions, evaluating the pathways for adaptation and mitigation. And I want to stress particularly social science. If we look at energy, the area that I'm working in, there are big technical problems, yes, but probably the economic problems and the political problems of getting people to adopt the right solutions are even bigger. Politics is big in this. Climate change is going to lead to greater immigration with huge political implications. Jim talked about water conflicts. And think about if the US really becomes energy independent due to the shale oil and shale gas revolution, think of the geopolitical implications. Are we going to have Chinese aircraft carriers in the Gulf rather than American? I don't know, but there are huge implications out there. Now, of course, these problems go back a long way. There were references to Spanish flu, but we can go back further. The Black Death was a genuine pandemic, killed between probably 75 million people or something like that. There have been some successes in dealing with a hole in the ozone layer. Very quickly, actually, identified in the early 70s, the Montreal Protocol was 1987. Another success is dealing with smallpox. It took longer. Vaccination to deal with this was identified in 1798, and it was only in 1979 that the World Health Organization declared the world free of smallpox. But it worked. And I think those cases are encouraging, but they could work because the science was very, very clear. No controversy, I don't think, no doubters. The threat's incredibly easy to grasp. Cancer from the ozone hole, you see the threat of smallpox. The solutions were simple and there were no losers. Of course, there are tricks that we've missed. We heard about the unpronounceable volcano, for example, or the Aceh tsunami. It was predicted, but nothing was done about it, although it would have been relatively simple and cheap to set up an early warning system. Of course, since then, there's been greater attention to natural hazard warning, and no doubt the recent meteorite events will add to that. So these cases were simple, clear, the threats easy to grasp, the solutions simple, no losers. Today, it's harder, the sort of problems we've been talking about today. They're much more complex, harder to analyze, harder even to agree in the scientific communities on the right route to solutions. The solutions are not clear-cut, and they're going to be very expensive, and there may be losers as well as winners. There are many players out there, scientists, governments, industry, NGOs, philanthropies. There are many different forms of partnerships, and various bodies with relevant mandates, and various global and regional initiatives, not necessarily optimized to the 21st century. Now, I want to talk briefly about a study that was made by the Royal Society, and I chaired the advisory board for this study. It was published 2 years ago with the title Knowledge, Network and Nations. And we looked at, in the third part of this report, it was just 30 pages, we did something that I don't think had been done before. We tried to took 5 examples of global efforts to tackle global problems, and we asked ourselves, how were they set up? How did they get on the agenda? What started them? Were there things we could learn from them? How they functioned? and what had gone wrong. In some sense, our report is telling you what not to do, actually. So we looked at the IPCC, the Gates Foundation, ITER, the International Fusion Project, international efforts to deal with carbon capture and storage, and the, what the hell is that? I always call it CIGAR, the Collaborative Group on International Agricultural Research. This was followed up last year by a much, much bigger study. We put 30 pages on this, 240 pages, of an OECD study which did much the same thing but with much more focus on governance, that looked at 7 cases. CGIAR and the Gates Foundation were common to both. The Group on Earth Observations, the IAEA, the Inter-American Institute for Global Challenge Research, the IEA Implementing Agreements, and the European Joint Programming Initiative, which I think, as far as I understand it, is trying to get better coordination between different national programs. And particularly, they looked at something called FACE. It must be in French because it doesn't stand for what it is in English. It's to do with food security and climate change. Now, I'm going to come in a minute to some of the conclusions from those studies. But looking at them, I realized that few, if any, of the bodies that we studied, 10 altogether, they did 5. They did 7, we did 5, and 2 were in common. Few of them looked holistically at the global environmental challenge from a really multidisciplinary perspective, which I think, I don't have to convince you the importance of this. The IAEA and the Global Earth Observations look at a broad range of issues, but from particular perspectives. In the first case, what can nuclear techniques do to this? From the second, from the point of view of Earth observations. The Inter-American Institute for Global Challenge Research does look at a lot of issues, but as far as I can tell, it seems to be mainly a coordinating and capacity building effort. And it has a regional focus. And I realize for this body, I ought to be talking about some body that looks holistically at the global and environmental challenges from a real multidisciplinary perspective. But as far as I know, and I'm happy to be corrected if I'm wrong about this, the only one is IIASA. And I'm not going to talk about it because we're going to hear from the director later. Much better to hear from him than to hear from me. What we found in these studies, first of all, in looking at global issues, there are 3 steps really. Identifying the challenge. And here, fundamental research of blue skies thinking, trying to imagine the unpronounceable volcano, still matters. Then the question is, how do we get this on the attention, on the radar screen of decision makers? And clearly, in the case of the Aceh tsunami, there were people, you can go back to the literature, saying, this is going to happen, here it's going to happen, something can be done, but they failed. There, I think the role of chief scientists and also of national academies, the Royal Society and so on, must be very important. Then there's trying to find out the right forum to set up something to do with it. I think you can look at the different models. I'm not going to go through this in detail, but use what exists if appropriate. And then when we come to implementation, there are big governance issues, keeping it simple and transparent, but they tend to conflict with getting buy-in to get as many partners around the table. And the OECD is particularly strong on governance. Reconciling different interests, national interests, interests of industry and so on. And then finally, capacity building, really, really important, and engagement. I think one thing you can say about the implementation is what we're trying to do is, what you should be trying to do is keep the politics out while being sensitive to the political boundary conditions. Try to make a scientific discussion, but you've got to understand the context. You can't do it in isolation, or the second you try to get anything to happen, you will fall flat in your face. The desiderata and the issues that came out of these studies was, first of all, that when looking for global solutions, as many countries as possible you want round the table. First of all, to bring in the best and the widest range of talents to bear that you can get hold of. And secondly, it's no good in a colonialist way going to countries saying, we have decided this is what you should do to help with global warming. If you want them in there, their scientists have got to be at the table. And of course, this produces tension, I believe, in the IPCC, for example, between inclusivity and scientific excellence. And it's yet another reason for capacity building. not just in the physical sciences. I must stress I'm talking equally about the social sciences, that there are people from all countries in the world who can participate as intellectual equals in these discussions. They have the intellect, it's a question of having the training. There is tension between coordination. It's easier to say we should do everything in a coordinated way around the world, but if we coordinate on the wrong path, that would be bad. We need some, free market out there. But also there's tension between that and encouraging local initiative and maintaining buy-in. CGIAR was an example of that, and that's which are absolutely essential. The major philanthropic input's very welcome, it's fast and flexible, but it does raise questions about accountability and although it's maybe putting money in, it's taking people away who might be doing other things. But on the whole, obviously a good thing to have more resources. The time needed to set up global organizations, if you're going to do it, especially if they're big infrastructure organizations, can be a real killer, has to be balanced against the advantage. And there are tensions between technical, political, and industrial interests. These are all you can read in the reports and the case studies. And in some cases, carbon capture, ITER also actually, although fusion is a long way out, the intellectual property issues may be a barrier. I would say, to conclude, that a global scientific collaboration, whether or not about these big global issues, is generally a win-win situation, if not always plain sailing. There are difficulties and barriers and transaction costs, and it should be fostered. Combining forces in looking at these global problems, however, is absolutely essential. It's essential to get the data. If you want to know about biodiversity, you need what's going on in different places to provide the best solutions and to ensure buy-in. The global challenges need a really multidisciplinary systems approach. It's all about systems thinking. I can't say it often enough. And it's about social sciences just as much as it is about the physical sciences, mathematics, and engineering. And my last point on that is I don't think we're doing a good enough job in training enough people to produce systems thinkers. In industry, they put people to work on problems, and they soon turn into systems thinkers, at least I hope they do. In universities, we're all tend to be in traditional academic ghettos, and we're rather bad at it. And I think that's something we could usefully come back to in the discussion later. Finally, Brian raised the question, is this the right time? Well, yes, I think it is. We're dealing with something non-linear, and if we don't act now, the longer it takes, especially true with infrastructure, as Jim said, that we have to take a long-term perspective before we look at it. And particularly, as Lord Durbin said, in looking at the cities and infrastructure in the developing countries, where there are huge opportunities because they're growing so rapidly. So it is the time to act. And my worry would be if we don't act now, we may face a Malthusian solution. Thank you very much.
So the landscape's getting bigger and more complicated and complex all the time, which is why we're all here, of course. So the next talk, if I may, is Dr. Jill Yeager, who's an independent scholar, I think. Sometimes. To talk about methodology and the value of integrated assessments. Jill, you know how to drive this, I'm sure you do.
Yeah, I can do the escape button first. Right. There we go. Right, so I'm going to talk about, now why have I got that? I'm going to talk about assessments, and I think perhaps before I dive into that, I should say one of my sort of underlying assumptions, which is that assessments are bringing together knowledge in a way that is useful for decision making. That's a kind of standard definition. It's not research. So what I'm talking about is bringing together knowledge in an assessment process, making it useful for decision making. The second thing I should say before I dive in is that the evidence that I'm using here, the things I'm going to talk about, are based on looking over a broad range of assessment processes that have taken place over the last 10, 15 years. I was asked in a study I did last year to look at what the trends are, and that's where I will take you for a few minutes this afternoon. And what I identified, and I'll go through these, are 8 trends in assessment processes that deal with the environment over the last 10, 15 years. And I'll go through each one of those now, so I don't need to tell you each one right off front. So the first trend that is clear, and it's come up, I think, in what you've already heard this afternoon, is a move from what started as integrated environmental assessment to integrated sustainability assessment. And in that trend, you see this need for the more integrated systemic perspective, because of cross-scale issues, which we've heard about already, and the cross-sectoral interactions. And without that systemic perspective, the assessment, the bringing together of knowledge, is going to produce solutions that are going to lead to problems elsewhere, something that was mentioned right at the beginning of the afternoon. So taking a systemic perspective is moving the focus of assessment processes from consideration of individual environmental issues, a water assessment, a climate assessment, to the overriding issues of human well-being and the quality of life. The second trend, and that was something that came very clearly in a study that the European Science Foundation did over the past 2 to 3 years, was a move from what was called a closed knowledge system to an open knowledge system. Closed being that we think the knowledge lies within academia and academic institutions and their friends and family, to a system that we have now where we're recognizing that scientists and researchers are not the only holders of knowledge, that there are many other societal actors that hold knowledge. Therefore, assessment processes becoming designed as participatory approaches, supporting the joint problem framing, framing not being done by the scientific community and then imposed, but a joint framing of what the problem is, an exchange of knowledge between all of the participants, which is really essential, therefore, for the not only credibility and the salience of what's going on, but also the legitimacy of the processes. Third trend is, again, a topic that we've heard this afternoon several times, from simplification to complexity. We realize that the societal challenges that we're facing are extremely complex. We need methods and tools that embrace this complexity. What we have done in the past was somewhat the other direction. We tried to simplify the problem to make it tractable, but we've realized that that is not bringing us in the direction that we need to go, especially if we talk about moving from environmental assessment to sustainability assessment. And you know, we've recognized now the feedback loops and the societal interactions that are so essential to considering these problems. So we have a trend towards using new kinds of methods and tools. Agent-based modeling is one example. New approaches for engaging in this discussion about what's the problem, like system mapping, and participatory scenario development, the idea of thinking about what the future looks like in a participatory way. So all of those and other approaches to looking at the complexity of the issues. Another topic that is a trend that has been mentioned already this afternoon, we had a tendency to think about problems, the fact that there are small increases from one year to the next, and now recognizing that there are huge non-linearities in these issues that we're discussing. So an increasing discussion not only about the tipping points, the planetary boundaries, abrupt non-linear changes, regime shifts, but recognizing that those are happening not just in the environment, but social tipping points, economic tipping points, and the interactions between all of these. And recognizing that dealing with these non-linearities clearly needs new approaches. Recognizing and accepting that non-linearity is there means, for example, that models that assume that everything will settle out into an equilibrium are not going to help us find solutions to the problems that we're facing. And another implication, which is because recognizing planetary boundaries and the fact that there are tipping points out there, is recently voiced in the word of looking at the higher end of scenarios. We also heard before, let's not just talk about 2 degrees anymore, let's talk about 4 or maybe 5 or 6 or higher end. We've got to start moving to those simply because we have recognized the fact that there are tipping points. So the idea that there are non-linear and abrupt changes pushes us to a need to look at these higher end scenarios. A further trend that we have seen over the last 10 to 15 years is this move from producing large assessment reports. IPCC is a good example of the sort of size of large assessment reports, and we'll probably see another one in Pavel's presentation. The broadening of the participation in assessment processes and the move towards a so-called open knowledge society has pushed us in the direction of not only having a big, thick assessment report at the end, but some ongoing and online documentation of the outcomes of assessments that continue all the time and where a broader public can become engaged in them. The example I have there is an assessment process that goes on in the city of Winnipeg in Canada, but there are many other examples of online assessments that the broad public gets engaged in a language that they can deal with, using social media, but to collect knowledge and to disseminate. Again, something that's a trend that we've seen in previous presentations, the idea that you, yes, have to think about the global level, but we recognize that we need the methods and the tools, and we have, to some extent, the methods and the tools, to move down to the level of local and regional. Two things is very clear for me here. The first is if you move towards participatory approaches, if you're increasingly thinking about how to solve the problems rather than just what is the problem, then you do need this shift to the local and the regional level, which is where the stakeholders have particular interest. From the sustainability point of view, however, what is clear is that you need integrated assessments at all of the spatial levels, and you need them in a nested framework so that you can begin to link local actions to the considerations of the planetary boundaries. If we did everything at the local level, we would perhaps solve problems here and create problems elsewhere. So there is this need of the nested framework and of looking at the big picture as well as what's happening at the local level. Next trend is then from what is the problem to how can we solve it. We've been very good at identifying problems, and we know that we can keep finding more. But there is a tendency also within assessment processes, even when we say that the assessment process itself is not policy prescriptive, but making recommendations, there's still this need to move the process in a way that the results can be implemented. And for this, it means that we've got to support the implementation of policies and measures and even behavioural change rather than just identifying problems. This has huge implications in how we run the assessment processes. From top down to bottom up, this is related to the participatory assessment process idea, the idea that stakeholders have to be engaged from the beginning, that they have to be part of the framing of the problem. The co-production was already mentioned. They have to be part of the scenario discussion. They have to be part of the assessment of impacts, vulnerabilities, and response options. But it does mean that science is no longer the definer of what the problem is. All of this has, for me, a set of implications which some have mentioned already, and which are essential for thinking about integrated sustainability assessment, bringing the knowledge together and doing something about it. The first one is the design of processes, designing processes that include the stakeholders, that are participatory, that are goal searching. They don't start with a defined goal, but they search for the goal. This design question is something that is extremely important, but has received relatively little attention. Secondly, a whole set of new skills. The skills of facilitation and moderation, needed if you want to have a truly participatory dialogue between all of the stakeholders. But at the same time, and that was mentioned at the end of the last talk too, the skill of systems analysis, the skill of looking at the system as a whole rather than looking and focusing at very small parts of it. It's a skill that we recognize we need, but we don't do a lot right now to build the capacity to do that. And a communication skill, again, something that was already mentioned this afternoon, something that we need to build capacity in if we're going to make this bridge between knowledge and action. It also has implications in terms of, what are the new features of the assessment landscape. One is this idea of an open knowledge system as opposed to what we have traditionally had as a fairly closed knowledge system. The feature of implementation orientation, the idea that we've got to move closer to discussing action and not staying in the problem framing mode. Participatory approaches, the new tools and approaches that are necessary if we're going to talk about and embrace complexity, and the idea that we need iterative processes, that this isn't something that you can just do in one shot and think it's all done with. Thank you.
Our last talk before we have an open discussion is from Professor Dr. Pavel Kabat, the director of IIASA in Vienna, who's going to sum up, I hope, the view of every talk that you've heard so far. Systems analysis approaches to global challenges takes us back to the beginning. Pavel.
Thank you, Brian. Let me see if I can get this working.
Go back to the desktop.
It's here. I should put it up. Right. Brian, your colleagues, it is my privilege and pleasure to be here. Royal Society, and that's a place where, as a young postdoc, I was invited by Keith Browning. You must know him, for the first GVEX meeting, but I was not GVEX, I was actually IGBP. And that's quite symbolic to say today, because IGBP at those times, 94, 93, was actually not on a good terms with WCRP. So we started to build a bridge between meteorology and hydrology and social sciences. And I think I would memorize it because that's quite symbolic for discussion today. We are discussing bridges between science disciplines and between different international efforts. My name is Pavel Kabat. I'm standing here as a IIASA director, but I have been IIASA director only for a year. I'm Dutch, and I have been living in the Netherlands for the last 35 years. But like IIASA, you know, IIASA is a product of the Cold War, so am I. I was born in Prague. When I was 10 years, we left the country, first for Austria, then for Canada, then left in Netherlands, and now at IIASA, at the place which was born from the Cold War II. Again, yet another, I think, symbolic, which I would like to memorize here. My job could be easy or very complicated. Easy, I could say what IIASA is. It's actually everything which you explained already this afternoon. I mean, it's not everything, of course, we don't do everything, but we are very close to many of the approaches which, of course, they would be too much too easy for me and maybe too much too optimistic because there is much work to be done. So let me just lead you quickly through what I think IIASA is. I will start with the global challenges and quickly go through it because they were already mentioned, not because I would like to again repeat what they are, but to show you in very simple way that they are indeed interconnected. Food. About 1 billion people still undernourished. This is the statistic which not only FAO but also IIASA helped to actually produce last 2 years. By 2030, the population will be there 1 more billion people. And again, this is a number which comes from IIASA. You may not know that until about 3 years ago, the population models have been shooting through the ceiling. We talked about 12 billion people. That because those models at that time, World Bank and others, were working with 2 parameters, fertility and economic growth. IIASA came with a group of Wolfgang Lutz, you may know him, with the 2 new parameters, which was education level of the women. Primary, secondary, and tertiary. You see, 12 billion people became only 9 billion people, quote, only because of this single parameter. Again, example of the transdisciplinarity. Well, at the same time, food, agriculture, of course, as an example, goes for water. And agriculture production, mainly irrigation, accounts for 70%, 70, of the water use. 6,000 cubic kilometers of fresh water is needed around the world, and 4,000 goes to agriculture. So from the agriculture, of course, we go to water, and again, water, just quickly through it, still 1 billion people not having access to the safe water, fresh water resources, and it is connected to many things, including energy. So hydropower currently accounts for 20% of the electricity, and of course, energy is an issue which I call one of the best hidden issues. If you go back to 1992, to Rio, and to 2002, Johannesburg, energy was not on the agenda. Yet, the numbers about how many people still do not have access to energy is 2.5 billion. It's much bigger than for water. The energy, of course, consumption grows, and based on the scenarios I will come to in a minute, by about 2035, there will be like 30% more energy needed. And that energy will have to come from a new type of system resources. Of course, the energy production is connected to the issue of climate, and 80% of the greenhouse gases comes from the energy chains. I'm not going to do this because you know all of it. Just look at the last one, yet another cross-section. This is relation between climate and poverty. 70 million Africans, for example, are currently suffering from the proven climate variability and change impacts. So last in my chain of the global challenges is the poverty equity. Now, This is one number, 25,000 children dying every day due to poverty. By the way, 4,000 of those are because of the energy, because of the cooking on the stoves, because of the CO choking, basically. This is interesting one. 80% of humanity lives on less than $10 a day, meaning that 20% is actually owning the world, and there is a 5% only around the world owning more than 70% of the global assets. Equity issue. Again, hunger and consequences of poverty. Now, we used to talk about this and still do as the challenges isolated. In fact, they are linked. They are linked in a way where the cross sections, the synergies, co-benefits, whatever you call it, are actually the most interesting part of it. And this is where IIASA is sitting. IIASA is not only looking into the in-depth studies into these three main challenges, but we are mainly interested in what happens when you combine it. What type of methods, mathematics behind you need to do it. What types of benefits you may get doing the cross-sectoral approaches. So, what's the IIASA approach? It's integrated, it's interdisciplinary, it's international, it's independent. I will come to it in a minute. It's solution-oriented, despite of the lot of basic sciences around there. It's a long-term oriented. It is about trade-offs. And this is one of the ways to say this is system analysis. Of course, there are many other ways. Now, advanced system analysis has not been invented by IIASA. It actually started by Rand Corporation and before. But IIASA took it up on board in the 70s. And IIASA did it in a number of ways, which led to quite a number of successes. For example, dynamic systems. You may know Buzz Holling, adaptive management. That was actually studied around IIASA in the 80s. Multi-criteria analysis decision. We have a number of tools still since 80s, 90s, which are being used now to support major leading world governments. Adaptive dynamics theory, not only in the ecosystem, but also in the physical systems and the social systems. Game theories. Many of the major economists around the world, including Tom Schelling and others, actually came to IIASA to work with us to develop game theories behind the major stability of the economic markets. Agent-based modeling will be mentioned as a new way to include the social sciences in the assessment. Stochastic optimization, I will show some of the examples, used actually in a rather applied way. New directions now and coming years, adding on those, again, new advances in the dynamic system modeling, but also focus on the extremes, which is very relevant to discussion today. And the integrated modeling is being enhanced at IIASA with these partners again. Sometimes I'm asked to show IIASA in one single slide. I did it last week when I was visiting the OSTP in Washington, Holdren. I used this picture, which actually we developed before IIASA in my global change time. IIASA is a place which is trying to put this puzzle together. Not being interested only in the mosaic itself, but mainly in the interaction. So it could be as disciplines, it could be scientific in-depth studies, it could be countries, it could be the scientists themselves. I will show you in a minute how this is happening, for example, at IIASA as an institution. What IIASA did, what is IIASA? I've been there for a year, and I can tell you, I haven't regretted any single second. It's a fantastic place to be for two reasons. You come there as a scientist, and I was as a mathematician, I did a lot of Earth system science. I'm still professor at the Earth system sciences in Wageningen, Netherlands. But when you get there, you got the academic freedom. There is a zero bureaucracy, believe me, because I'm a director to tell you. Nobody has a permanent contract, meaning that everything is competitive. There are contracts between 1 week and 1 year maximum, extendable. We have like 200 people in-house every moment, but 3,000 scientists around the world working with us based on the projects. The council, which is my boss, tells me, okay, your only charge is when you have a problem, project, get the best brains together to work on it. Now, this is what is, for academics like we are, I think, a kind of dream scenario. IIASA has produced and collaborated with many of the great leading minds of this world. I'm just showing something, not all of them. Altogether, 11 Nobel Prize winners were associated with IIASA in 40 years. Some of them did their main research during their period there, including, of course, the IPCC cohort, which many of you are in the room associated with. IIASA is also known for its focus on the young scientists, new generation, young generation. IIASA started its so-called Young Scientist Summer Program, which is a heavily competitive summer training, so-called research triplets, not just classes, but doing research together with the IIASA scientists. Every year, 550 chosen from about 1,000 applications comes to us, and they are disciplinary, they are cross-disciplinary, and they keep coming back to IIASA. Outcome of such a study is a paper, and about half of them comes back as a postdoc to work with the IIASA programs. This is our partitioning of the institute, natural scientists, social scientists, mathematics and others. Actually, a lot of mathematics still from the what I call old Russian and American school. My oldest mathematician is 84, working with this Moscow State University, working with his colleague for the last 20 years from Harvard, sitting together in a room with the young, brilliant kids from South Korea and Japan. They are just 23. Again, talking about the environment which stimulates you every day to come and to go. It's international, I mentioned. We collaborate with a couple of institutions from nearly 40 countries now. I mentioned already 3,000 associates with IIASA research. How it started? This is the world in the 70s. Divided world, top of the possible Cold War. The Berlin Wall still there, oil crisis. At that time, it was Lyndon Johnson, American president, who took over after Kennedy was assassinated, to approach the Soviets with an idea to build a bridge. Bridge between the best scientists they could find both worlds. And it happened actually here in this very house. In October, 4th October 72, 40 years ago, the IIASA Charter was signed at Royal Society in London by 12 countries. 5 of them from the former Eastern Bloc, the other one from the Western Bloc and Japan. Of course, the leading was United States and Soviet Union, Russia at that time. IIASA developed since then, of course. Right now, we have 20 member countries on our council. If you see the flags, if you can place them, you see that there is quite a transition from the east to west to north to south. Of course, because in 1991, 1992, after the wall went down, the question was what to do with IIASA. There was a visionary of the Austrian government at the time to call together a ministerial conference with about 60 countries, which confirmed IIASA for its global mission. So it's now east, west, north, south building, scientific building bridge. And IIASA is fortunate at this moment to grow. Last year, 2 new countries joined, Australia, Indonesia, and we are in negotiation with a couple of other countries to join us very soon. You may be interested to hear about UK, but I won't tell you much about UK because we will be discussing probably this during the discussion. UK was a founding member, and UK unfortunately left IIASA in 82, 83 for political reasons, and it never came back, although there is many UK scientists on IIASA staff. I must say there's 20 countries who are part of the council, do not put any limits on me, so I have 52 nationalities on my staff, so there is no real string attached to it. This is our home. We are hosted by the Austrian government in one of these places, Castle of the Habsburg monarchy, and it's a free gift by the Austrian government to host IIASA there. Okay, that was institution IIASA, briefly, quickly, hopefully. Now let me go to research to show you some of the research highlights. Again, I would like to remind that we are mainly focusing on the cross-section between those major challenges, so those gray, dark shaded areas. I will show you some of the highlights based on the different areas of our work. Energy and climate. In effect, energy and climate has been at IIASA from very early beginnings of discussion. You may not know that many of the first reports, first discussions about, much before IPCC, about CO2 connected to climate happened at IIASA. Many of your colleagues, and probably yourself, have been there during those times. I know some of you were there because I knew that your papers were published there. In 76, first ever discussion about carbon dioxide, climate society. I think, Julia, you were there with it, right? Yeah. On this one. So it's quite nice to actually see this one. In 80, first report about the energy assessment, which was commissioned by 12 countries. And then, of course, other studies leading to the current generation of the models. Now, IIASA has been associated with many things, sometimes with the too policy relevant. Let me show you that, at least in my period and period before me, this is not only the case of science, policy. We talk about highly published work. I will show you some of the statistics, and there are some examples outside of this room where the policy relevant work is being published in parallel in a leading international journals. Now, let me give you some example. of the system thinking. This is an example of one of the papers published in Nature Climate Change last year and later in Science, showing the value of synergies and co-benefits. When you look into a problem of energy future, the air pollution and the climate mitigation together rather than in separate sectoral studies. We use the models, combined models. We have both equilibrium models in the economic sense, but also the basic climate models and message models to calculate what would happen if you would do the investment only for the energy security. The vertical axis shows the percentage of the global GDP cost, only for the air pollution, only climate. And altogether, this will be about 1.1% of the GDP globally. When you take this as a system view, putting together a coherent measures which are co-benefiting from investment, it's about 40% cheaper. Now, this is the only picture I used when I presented this work at the summit Rio Plus 20, which of course speaks for itself because the synthesis and analysis of systems shows economic value. It shows savings in the investment around the world. Here's another one. You may know that IIASA developed in the 90s a air quality leading models called GAINS family, which are now used to support all of the EU policies for air quality control, but also the air traffic quality control. And it's also connected to the major work around megacities. For example, IIASA did the calculations for Beijing Olympic Games to come with the measures how to keep Beijing for 3 weeks kind of pollution-free to be able to go for the Olympics. Yet another work published recently is about the co-benefits of mitigation and sink and forestry. I have no time to go deep into it, but we have a number of large projects there. One of the biggest things we published last year was an energy assessment of global systems. It was done over 6 years, including 300 authors from academia, public and private sector. What it did a number of sub-studies. As a matter of fact, my colleague Grubler gave a lecture last week at the UCL about this one. It looked into the technology transition paths, but it did 41 combinations of energy resources into the future in terms of the plausible solutions to supply the world by energy in a way that how we are used to it into the Western world. So these scenarios are here. It did all these scenarios, of course, based on a recent events like Fukushima, post-Fukushima, with and without nuclear scenarios, and based on the current discussion about shale gas. As a matter of fact, I came here almost straight from Washington when we had a discussion last week with the US government, where the US government commissioned the IIASA to do a major study on the shale gas futures. That was interesting to discuss here. And of course, the IIASA will not be doing study about oil. We will be looking into what could it mean? What could it mean globally? Is it sensible? Is it not sensible? How the world markets would look like if this will be sustained in the United States? Where the OPEC countries will go if there is no US market? This type of studies. It did, of course, the whole transformation of the energy systems until 2100. But what it mainly did, let me just go, it did, of course, per county level calculation. For example, this is the China portfolio 2050. We did specifically for China when it comes to the GA scenarios compared to their own policies. It changed quite a lot, if you see, based on the GA calculations. But again, it did it all for 4 sectors. For the energy security, for the air pollution because of the standards which we kept in the system for the megacities, and for the mitigation of climate change. So the whole energy futures in this particular assessment is based on a system analysis approach. Now, it was cited quite a lot. As a matter of fact, this assessment was the basis for United Nations Energy for All policies. Secretary General received the report, as you see, last October. It was interesting to listen to his comment. He said to me, there are 10,000 NGOs around the world, and there is a lot of UN agencies I can turn to. But I am talking to you, IIASA. I said, why? He said, because you are fast. You are not bureaucratic. You are much faster than anybody else. This is interesting to hear from such a system. Food and water, again, a lot of interesting studies which were done by IIASA over the last 20 years, including the latest study with FAO showing the food potential gaps, meaning where we can do more to produce more of the food before we start to expand enormously on the land use. This was published together with FAO last year as a major outlook. We are also doing a lot of citizen science or crowdsourcing, if you like. This is an example of project where so-called GeoWiki, where we use like 2,000 reporters around the world to enhance the land cover maps, which of course is an interesting product needed for all the land use related agriculture forestry studies. We have a group of the evolution ecologists, mathematicians, who look into the evolution, for example, in marine environment fisheries. And this is an example of a study which was published in Nature last year, showing the way how the abrupt drop in the chain of the fish evolution could actually mean a complete collapse of the major fisheries. Actually showing into the intervention, somebody mentioned this also this afternoon, non-linearity in the management systems. We are just starting to do a major assessment on water, and Julia, this will be exactly what you say. It will be ensemble-based hydrological models driven by ensembles of the CIMIP, including the statistic and stochastics of the impact models. This is exactly what's now coming. It's coming too late for the impact community, maybe 5 years too late, but it's coming now. It also does, IIASA, research community, studies into the, for example, coalition stability based on the game theories, mathematics, and on the mathematics of the stochastic coalition formation. People like John Nash, maybe you know Beautiful Mind. He visited IIASA 4 times, and there's still his chair on it. Then, actually, he may be still coming with Alicia next year to see us for summer right now. And for example, what we have done study. I'm putting this one because it might be interesting for you to look into the futures of the EU with or without UK. And it's being published now. It's also so-called free riding concept. I'm sorry to use this terminology in this house, but that's what it is. And it actually came to interesting results. Of course, we started with those low basics. We use all these methodologies here, and we look into the way of incentives and basically carrot and stick balances in it. And this is the result of it. PNS paper before, showing that yes, there is an optimum combination of carrot and stick which could be used to both keep UK within the EU system or let UK leave without major consequences. Both is possible. There is no journalist in this room to cite me on this? No. Okay. Right, then. Now, I talk about scientific output. I just wanted to show you that this is really quite interesting to see the growth. You see here that, for example, the number of citations. I'm talking about citations only in top 10. Nature Science, PNAS, and Derivates, not in the other journals. It's about 5,000 plus in 2011, and it was last year, 2012, almost, this was, by the way, the June picture. It was like 6,500 on it. This is the way how it's developed over the last 6-7 years. I'm putting it here because I knew a little bit of the history of discussion about IIASA in UK. One of the points was that IIASA maybe used to be too much policy-oriented, not too much basic science. They're definitely not true anymore over the last 5 years and in the future. This is our H index, of course, cumulative one, I mean, for the group. I think it's not bad. I compare this one with the other international institutions in it. We do research into policy, of course we do, and there are a couple of things which I could tell you. For example, this very successful GAINS model, which is the three-dimensional non-hydrostatic model, which is looking into the atmospheric chemistry in the cities, megacities. Resolution is actually street meters, being used from Beijing all the way up to Mexico City to actually support the measures in the air quality control. We are sitting as we speak at more than 6 advisory boards for the major international organizations and also for the governments. For example, the US government, which is still the biggest part of IIASA support, is now organizing a yearly briefing of the OSTP and of the Office of the Foreign Secretary about major results. For example, Arctic study we are starting, or the tropical feature study. Interest in IIASA is rising. This is an interesting picture which I would like to talk to you about over the dinner maybe, showing the way how IIASA played a role during the 80s and 90s. New countries are coming to us, showing interest in yet another example of the system study. For example, this is the science minister of Indonesia, Indonesia joined IIASA last year, and they asked us to do a study together with Brazil and Malaysia to look into the integrative system view of the futures of the tropical forest. What I should say now, this is a symbolic picture. Welcome soon in IIASA. I mean really all of you to come, but I also mean UK science community and UK as such. Thank you very much.
Well, that's the end of presentations. We're now going to have an open panel discussion. I apologise for not keeping us strictly to time. We're running a wee bit late, but not catastrophically so. Gives me great pleasure to hand the chair to Lord Rees, who, as most of you will know, was President of the Royal Society. So he knows this house very well. Martin, the floor is yours.
Can I go here?
Ah, we've run out of chairs. We just put one more.
I think I'll probably stand up more. I'll stand up.
We can let Martin stand up.
Okay. Well, I'd like to start off by thanking all the speakers, and especially thanking Dr. Kabat for giving us such a good survey of what's being done at IIASA. And I think we heard from the earlier speakers that the problems which are crucial require interdisciplinary and international action, and that is what IIASA does. And I think the other virtue of IIASA is because it is officially international, its assessments have a credibility which perhaps makes them more readily accepted by nations than those that come from more overtly partisan organisations. So I think we've had a very good discussion, and we're running 15 minutes late, but I think we should allow ourselves to have half an hour for discussion. So we'll have half an hour before we adjourn, and this is a chance to raise questions. So what I'll do is I'll take questions, and we'll use most of the half hour for those questions, but then right at the end I'll ask each speaker to give us some last words. Can we take questions two at a time? So could I invite first two people who'd like to ask questions? Yes, could we have one there and the one right at the back? Yes, sir.
Thank you very much for the nice talk. I want to comment the one ideological stuff and the another one for the practical thing. The first one is the it's about the ideological one. But the today we heard much about the issue or the risks and something that we need to solve together worldwide, globally. But I guess it's for the long term. One of the important things is the simple target or dream or the kind of hope for the young people. So maybe 50 years ago, we had the Apollo project, and also in Japan. I'm from Japan, Kyoto Universities. But 50 years ago, we have a comic called Astro Boy. That kind of simple target is encouraging us to go forward for science or engineering. So for solving this kind of the very complex world, I guess someone needs to invent such kind of simple dream. So I want to hear about such kind of thing. And the practical thing.
Can we just do one question?
Right, it's an ideological one. I have another kind of the practical one.
Okay, and at the back.
Hello, my name is David Lowry. I'm a researcher on energy issues. I want to ask a question about ethics and the issue of the interconnectivity of the nuclear fuel cycle. Some people might know that national governments within the European Union have to go through a process where they justify the benefits against the detriments of new nuclear installations before they can give planning permission. UK government has gone through this process. As part of the process, they commissioned studies on the detriments of producing nuclear energy. And one of the studies looked at how much detriment would occur in the UK and how much would occur from the international nuclear fuel cycle in its production. And they came to the conclusion that 92% of the detriment would arise from outside of the UK. And then in their wisdom, the ministers decided that that was none of their business. They wouldn't look at 92% of the detriment. They'd only take into account 8%, and therefore argued to Parliament that therefore the benefit outweighed the detriment. I'd like to ask the panel, do they think that's an ethical way of approaching policy making?
Well, I think that's a question which perhaps Brian Collins would like to comment on.
I mentioned in my talk about coming to a more ethical position about valuing your ethical principles. I think your example is a very good one of where we need to re-examine to what extent nation states alone should make that type of evaluation when actually the energy systems that we are developing in our nation states either explicitly or implicitly get exported in terms of products and services all over the planet. So there's lots of examples where we know we're using product in this country where we think it's a low carbon product, but actually when you look back up the supply chain, you find that some part of it has been manufactured in a country where the carbon footprint is much greater than our own. So I would agree with you that we should not be using that type of approach. The transition from the principles that we've got at the moment, as you illustrate, to something that might seem to be more equitable and the timescale over which we do it, I think is probably the most fundamental question. If you think what were the ethical principles of Tudor kings, you can see that actually it might take a century or two. Now, we probably can't afford a century or two. And I think for our anthropologists and social scientists, understanding how to accelerate the rate of change of ethical principles might be an interesting study.
Thank you. Anyone else want to comment on that or on the other question?
Oh, go on.
Yes. Okay, well, let's have two more questions. Yes, one there and one there. Okay.
Hi, I'm Stephen.
Sorry, we'll come back to you later.
I'm Stephen Bishop from UCL. I have a personal interest in creating narratives for policy decision making in order to understand problems and explain them. I would argue, based on your talks, actually, that for the ozone hole, we got it right. For climate change, we probably got the narrative wrong. How do we learn from both of those to get these interconnected systems, which are harder, correct?
Gentleman there.
Ian Mitchell, Operational Research Society. I've been very struck by the needs to link up across very diverse groups, and that systems thinking, particularly causal loop diagrams, seem to be a very effective way to get very diverse groups to communicate. So I would value the panel's views on how we could better promote that approach to communicate the ideas of interdependency between these very different groups.
Two very broad questions. Who wants to start on?
I'll go to the second one.
Second one, yes. Okay.
The first one.
So the systems approach, I mean, it's something one learns sort of by doing, but the question is, how can we encourage, the question I was raising, I'll ask the question I raised, which I think is related to yours in my talk. How can we do a better job in teaching people? And I think, I mean, I'm thinking from the perspective of universities here. Probably the right level is at the graduate level. If you try to make people broad too young, they may end up, a bit shallow everywhere. But there again, we're not really doing it. Most of our PhDs are actually extremely focused. And I think some sort of very broad doctoral training centers, it's not the way EPSA thinks. They're just these. For those who don't know it, that most PhDs are now 4 years with 1 year taught. And EPSRC has been advertising, we'll fund some. And we tried to persuade them they should do one in energy, where the thesis could be very narrow, but the teaching will be really across the board. That somebody doing something in, let's see, new photocells in physics, the teaching would embrace energy policy, energy economics, the whole thing. But that's too broad for them. Not interested. They didn't put it on the agenda. So actually we're thinking of going out and getting industrial sponsorship. Because when I talk to people in industry, they say, would you be interested in graduates who not only had a PhD at the traditional level, but actually had courses right across the board in energy, and maybe we could go wider into the environment, but energy is already pretty broad. They say yes. So we're thinking of that. I'd be interested in everybody else here is thinking of that. If I mention some other thing in Oxford which we're actually doing, I don't know the outcome yet. We have a new School of Public Policy, School of Governance, and it has a compulsory science element in it. They claim it's the first Masters in Public Policy in the world with a compulsory science element. My French friends tell me that's not true. I haven't done the research. We're just doing it. I taught a course in energy last week. There was a course in climate change. This is not trying to teach all the science of energy, obviously not, but it's trying to teach a rather diverse group of future policymakers and civil servants how to deal with scientific evidence and what are the big issues. We're picking a few examples. Epidemiology is another. It'd be interesting to know how that goes, and I'd be interested to know anybody else who's tried to do that with people largely with a policies, social science background, to try to teach them to think about the energy system in a holistic way. But I think here, to come back to my neighbor here at IIASA, this is something we can benefit from IIASA, because the way we learn things is apprenticeship in research, really. There aren't so many systems thinkers in the UK to be an apprentice to. There are some. But IIASA has the Young Scientist program that was advertised, but more than that, it has postdoc positions. We ought to be sending young people out there as postdocs to really sit in this environment with, you heard, a third engineers, mathematicians, a third scientists, a third social scientists, for a couple of years working in that environment. And I think that's something we're greatly missing by not being a member of IIASA, is the opportunity to send people there as apprentices, if you like, to learn.
Any follow-up on that before we go on to Julia? Would you like to comment on that?
Yes. Robert Mackay, University.
Yes. Yes.
Robert Mackay, University of Warwick. I'd like to defend EPSRC in that they are sponsoring some doctoral training centres who are precisely producing systems thinkers, like my own at the University of Warwick.
Okay.
Yes, some.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay. Yes. Okay.
I can think of one in the area I'm interested in, but it's
yes. Well, Julia was asked a very difficult question about why climate change is harder to deal with than the ozone hole. So, in one sentence.
Really? I think narratives are really important on the climate change problem, not least because of the uncertainties around it and the way that we have traditionally couched it in something like global mean temperature, which is impossible for people to relate to. We've got to personalise it. I think the other difference with the ozone hole was, it wasn't going to affect people personally, not large parts of the world, but also there was a technological solution out there. And so industry could see how they could work to solve it. I think climate change, the technological solution is not there yet, and yet the impacts on people personally through, I would say, the work of the deniers is actually not helping us. And until we can personalise the narrative and think about things like even the past year in the UK or the unprecedented drought in the US, etc., and actually scientifically attribute some of those things partially to climate change and get a strong message out there, then we're going to have difficulty winning it. So I'm very keen on using narratives and making them as personal as possible so that people can understand that it's not somebody over there, but it's me that's going to feel this.
The problem is it's long-term and diffuse, and for that reason perhaps it's easier to get people to support adaptation than mitigation, because the adaptation benefits the country that pays. whereas the mitigation is only effective
Absolutely,
when
and
everyone
that
else
is
joins
also
in.
the other part of it, yes.
Yes.
It might just be worth pointing out that on those narratives, IIASA was the place in the 90s where the first studies were made of international environmental governance, and the comparison was made between the ozone success and what was happening in the climate change negotiations, together with a whole series of other international environmental issues and how they were dealt with. And that moved also into trying to not only tell the good narrative, but do some policy exercises, have people almost game playing to experience themselves the difference between negotiating an ozone protocol and negotiating a climate agreement because of those differences that Julia just mentioned.
Any other comments on those two questions? Any other questions? So Chris Benticle and lady at the back.
Well, we've heard a very good survey of all the subjects covered, and I think we're all convinced, if we weren't before, about the need to more effective communication of those problems and taking policy decisions on the basis of them. Now, there's one subject that I'd rather like to ask Dr. Kabat about, which I think is very important, and I think so far has been rather neglected, which is the relationship between this and current orthodoxy on economics. We need really to think, not just think differently about the subjects that we've heard about and to put them all together more effectively. We need, in fact, to look at orthodox economists and the way in which they, in many respects, mislead by emphasizing such things as, quote, growth, unquote, GDP, all the rest of the rubbish that you hear every day. We need to think differently about economics as well as the other things. And when you put all these together, you come out with some rather different solutions. So I would like to invite the panel to comment on that thought and let us know how you're going to tackle this issue, essentially, of communication.
We have the question at the back.
I wanted to bring up the issue of credibility because we are talking about the need to train more young systems thinkers. And I can tell you that coming from a situation where I have my previous postgrad qualification in systems analysis and design, I'm now doing my second postgrad at Oxford. And when you bring this stuff up, both in industry and in academics, you tend to be faced with people who think that you're crazy. And so there's a deal of, you can be trained to use this stuff, but then you come and you try and use it, and people block you at every turn. So I'd be interested in hearing about that. Thanks.
I think, Dr. Kabat, would you like to start on maybe both questions?
On the economic, if I may start, at the IIASA conference, which celebrated 40 years, and some of you were there, there was a session on the way how the economic system, economic thinking actually is out of date. As you know, we are still in the 1628 economic world, right? And that's where it already started. That's what Professor Nordhaus, you may know him, he gave a lecture as a part, by the way, IIASA alumni, IIASA associate, about changing that. And I must confess that the transition economies and econometry, which was quite strong at IIASA in the 90s, disappeared. And we are now trying to build the community of economists again, including those like Nordhaus and others, to come back and to help us. It's not only an issue of an economic model. For example, the Yale School, as you know, is about so-called economic clubs rather than the GDP growth. It's also about evaluating the non-monetary type of elements of the system. Cost internalization. I mean, we have a lot of debate on it. You know what happened by the very interesting contribution which Professor Nick Sten did here in UK, by the way, also IIASA associate, coming to the zero discount rate. So we are going to put together a group as a kind of cross-cutting through all the programs team, which will be discussing this first to see what can be done on those grounds.
Anyone else on economics? Yes.
Yeah, I think one has to proceed with quite a degree of subtlety in terms of rejecting economics. On the one hand, not getting tied into some of the straitjackets of equilibrium and endogenous growth and so on, but also recognizing the the rigor and structure which economics can provide to the way in which we think about things like opportunity costs, about welfare, about risks, and the way in which it provides a route into decision-making, in particular into decision-making in government. So on the one hand, we've got to approach it, as everyone on the panel has been saying, as skeptics, but on the other hand, recognise that it provides a rational route into decision-making as well.
Brian, you've had to deal with these questions in government.
Which one, the economics one or the systems one?
Well, the economics first, perhaps.
Interesting. I mean, when I was the chief scientific advisor in BIS, and everyone started talking about growth, I said, growth of what? And there was a look of, well, GDP, what else? And well, like you, I felt that that completely denudes the debate from anything that offers opportunities to reconsider what makes a developed society. What are the value propositions? And so I didn't have much time left when I made that question as Chief Scientific Advisor, but I still actually believe that actually we should be looking at what are the values that we're attempting to grow, and economic well-being is one of them, but there are lots of others, and maybe at this point in time we need to reevaluate what the balance is between those various factors on which we put value in a developed society. And that is not just because of developed societies, it's actually in developing societies as well. So I think that's a broader view of what economics is about, and some economists are quite happy to encompass that, and quite a lot aren't. So I think that's an interesting conversation. Could I say something about the systems question? Because that's also something that I started off in my other chief scientific advisor position in the Department for Transport, when I discovered there was relatively little systems thinking around transport, which might surprise you, surprise me too. And I set off on a crusade, and one of the things I discovered, looking a little bit at the history, because one of the things I didn't want to do was repeat too many of the mistakes of history, was what the relative population of disciplines were in the civil service in the previous 50 or 60 years. And much to my surprise, I found at the end of the Second World War, in the 40s and 50s, most people in the civil service, apart from generalists who did the general civil service, if you were a specialist, you were either an operational analyst, an engineer, or a scientist. There were almost no economists. Now, you can say, actually, that was why we were in such a mess in the 50s and 60s, because there weren't enough people looking after the money. And the transition from the 40s and 50s through to now, where you'll find that is completely reversed, is quite interesting, because what we're beginning to see, and I can't get to a workshop that is being run by actually someone who's the head of the operational analysts group coming out of the Ministry of Justice, is on systems thinking in government. And it's just started again. So colleagues in the room I know, because I can see one or two nods from ex-colleagues, know that that is happening. So I think it's just beginning to come back. So I should not feel quite so lonely if I was you in the future, and push back even harder, because you're absolutely right, as you'll have gathered from today, that systems thinking is on the ascendancy.
I just wanted to comment on the system thinking as well, because I think those of us who work in particular disciplines are well aware of the complexity and the depth of science you need in those particular disciplines. And I think one of the problems going into the system approach is how do you manage to retain that, but also instill from it the key things that really matter for the system you're looking at. And I would take, for an example, the integrated assessment modelling that's been done in the past, where many of us who are climate scientists look on with horror at the way the complexity of the climate system is represented in those. There are no non-linearities, there are no concept of tipping points in those systems. And so we tend to dismiss them. So I think the way to break this down is about collaboration, that you will, whilst building systems thinkers, you do need to maintain the integrity of the core sciences that enter into it.
Absolutely.
You need to have both, and that's why I think it's very difficult for people who are trying to break those barriers sometimes to get respected, because people like me say, well, you don't understand the complexity of my system, whereas they're trying to understand the complexity of how the various systems interact. So I think there's a lot we need to change here, but not to lose sight of the the core science that must have the integrity that it needs to make the system analysis robust.
Chris, briefly.
Very briefly, there is some thinking about different new economics and so on going on at the Institute of Complexity in Santa Fe. It's a slightly flaky new age place in some ways, but there's some very good work going on there. And in fact, I'm rather surprised they don't have better relations with IIASA.
I'm going to visit them next month for a whole
Excellent.
day.
I was there last summer and I couldn't detect any connections.
Okay, last round of questions. You had... Yes.
I was intrigued by a remark. I think it was Professor Slingo who mentioned the link between the science, so the scientific questions, strictly scientific questions, and the more systemic issues that come up when you look at things globally. But how do you formulate the more systemic issues? Because if you do, then you're immediately introducing value judgments about what should be looked at. Where is the neutrality in all of this then?
Let's take two more questions there, and then.
Sure about that.
So we could remember doing.
Pardon?
You try it and then you revamp. It's not a linear process.
Thank you very much. First of all, I've been incredibly heartened by the discussion that's been going on. I'm from the Systems Centre at the University of Bristol, and I don't think this is working, by the way. But nevertheless, I want to put some really encouraging thinking about this, because actually we're finding that young people who we're developing to doctorate level are incredibly sought after. I mean, they're a competition for their services when they leave us with doctorates and professionally based training as well, because they do NHDs and therefore they're doing it for industry. They really are highly sought after, and please, anybody who's got interest in this area, come to our website. You're very welcome to join into the networks, because it will be through networks of these people that these problems will be overcome. The sharing of knowledge, sharing of experience across discipline and across domains is the basis for really accelerating this process.
And, yep.
I'm very impressed also by the good arguments made for systems approaches and the problem of unintended consequences if you don't involve other disciplines. However, we've not heard a mention about medical science in all this today. And I think if you really want to sell the dangers for humanity in the future, you really have to co-opt good medical scientists onto committees and so forth, because they do have a proper multidisciplinary training in science. But I was glad to see social scientists mentioned as well, actually.
Yes. Okay. Yes. These are comments more than questions.
This is
Yes. Yes.
This is a question along the same lines. I'm Trevor Lanwarn, and I guess like Brian Collins, I'm now in government as the government actuary. And my question is, to what extent, given all that you've been saying about collaboration internationally, to what extent do you think there's some benefits to start more collaboration with other people of influence? And I would put the accountants as a major opportunity for influence, along with the medical profession just mentioned there, because you can start getting influence through lots of different strands. And so my question is, do you see some cross, not just academic, but cross-professional benefits from collaboration?
And very last question, a gentleman there.
Thank you very much. Jason Blackstock from UCL and former IIASA postdoc, actually. And my question builds off of both Jill's presentation and a handful of the comments about training the next generation in systems thinking. And I'm particularly interested in where you see the gaps in our ability to teach this right now. And Jill, I was thinking particularly the fact that you raised facilitation and engagement, that the systems that we're dealing with aren't just technical systems, and while we do need to respect the fundamental science of the research, we are also doing so much more engagement with broad communities, with policymakers, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on where our frontiers of learning how to teach better or learning what we need to be teaching in that front might be.
Okay, I think in view of the time, what I'm going to do is ask speakers to speak in turn, addressing the questions and also giving any particular thoughts they have about how best IIASA could focus on what seem the most important or perhaps most understudied areas. One aphorism which I think is very important is that the unfamiliar is not necessarily the improbable, and we've got to focus on ensuring that we've covered all the possible risks. So I wonder if shall I go along, starting, which end shall we start? Shall we start with you, Jim? Okay. With comments on those last set of questions and any final thoughts.
Well, let me go straight to the final thoughts. I'll leave the questions to my to my colleagues.
Sort of rugby is that?
They'll, and I'm conscious that Lord Deben isn't here, and in a sense he was the outlier in amongst our talks, which were dwelling upon science and assessment, as one would expect them to do. But I'm very glad that he drew attention to the political context of what we're doing and the process by which science connects with that political process. I suppose I was dismissed in his talk as being, I think he referred to the sensible, orderly manner of sorting out what's required once you've got the political consensus established. And I suppose I see my business and that of a lot of the science going on around the table of doing that sensible, measured, proportionate analysis of risks and responses and options. But that, to some extent, I think, I don't think he was intending to understate the complexity of that, but embedded within that are the value judgments, and the need to then communicate what the outcomes and implications of science are, and that's an area which has an enormous amount of work to do further in it, and I think collaboration with IIASA can contribute a great deal in that sense.
And I'm sure we all approve of more collaboration with medics and with accountants. So let's go on to Brian next.
I'd agree, actually. I mean, I'd include lawyers, actually, because lawyers are another discipline which frame the way in which people think about things, either through contractual obligation or importantly, through litigation fear, which in different parts of the world has a different limiting effect on how people think laterally about new ways of behaving. And that's quite interesting, actually, I think, when you start looking at the role of parliamentarians, whether they're in government or not, in putting in place statute law, which then guides you for a long term, because the only instrument that we seem to have for governance over the longer term at the moment is to set it in law, which seems to me to be incredibly crude, because the reason people do that is so that it's quite difficult to unpick it. And a lot of for instance, I've done quite a lot of study of the regulation of utilities, and if you read the original papers that were written in the late 70s of the privatisation of the utilities, it actually says in all the words, we're going to wrap this up so tightly in legislation that it's absolutely unpickable. Now that was not for good governance, that was for political purpose. And for me, as a public good, that was entirely an unethical thing to do. But of course, we're in a democracy, so that sort of thing happens. So I think there's something in the longer term of how we govern the longer term of the public good. And if there's one area that I'd love to hear the anthropological studies across the planet of how that works or doesn't work, and has worked in what I heard Jared Diamond say at a lecture in UCL the other day, in traditional societies, by which he meant tribes of New Guinea. And actually they're still fairly primitive, but still sustainable tribes in New Guinea. Think about that. They're still there. There are other tribes on other parts of the planet. All we can see is their archaeological remains. So that, for me, is quite interesting, is how do we maintain sustainability of governance for these long-term things whilst dealing with the shorter-term exigencies that are facing us. And I don't think we know how to do that. I don't think democracy, as we've currently configured it, is in a very useful place. Now, I'm a physicist saying this, so I'm way outside my comfort zone, but I still think that's an important area for IIASA to deal with.
Thank you. Julie.
So I'll start with the things that I picked up particularly from today's discussion, and I think very encouragingly that we're moving now to think much more about non-linearities in the system, of tipping points, not just tipping points in the natural system, but actually how socio-economic structures can have tipping points that are often triggered by relatively small changes in natural systems. For example, in my own area of weather and climate, that we wouldn't, in my science, think of as tipping points. And I think that that is a very important way forward, because we can already see our vulnerability to extreme events is emerging quite strongly and quite rapidly. The other thing I would say, and when we go to system approaches, I think the degree to which you have complexity versus simplicity is to some extent a judgment call, and it depends on whether by simplifying you affect the fundamental properties of the system you're trying to look at. And I think we have a lot of thinking still to do about how complex do we need to represent the Earth system, for example, to be able to get at the fundamental properties that will drive our decision-making and policies. And that, of course, is again a value judgment, and that's where the dialogue with the users in the broadest sense is so important. And of course it's an iterative process, because every year we see the world throw up new things that we had not anticipated, such as the Russian heat wave and the impact on food prices, impact on price of food in the Middle East. You could say a trigger for the Arab Spring, maybe, I don't know. But, you know, we have to learn year by year from what we observe and adjust our perceptions and our thinking and where the complexity versus simplicity has to come in.
Well, first, thank you for all of the suggestions. That's an extremely valid comment about what could be added or what could be expanded. There are some excursions. For example, we have the institutional and legal aspects at IIASA. I didn't mention we have a quite strong group of theologists, actually, which is interesting, how that group is playing a role in many of the projects because of the transitions around the world. I cannot answer everything. Just let me give you two examples of what actually started because of discussions like this one. First, on the respect and education and further training. We already mentioned the Young Scientist Summer Program. What we are going to do now, starting as of next year, with the support of, for example, NSF and other agencies around the world, we will start so-called International School of Excellence of the postdocs. 50 postdocs. Selected around the world from IIASA member countries. 3 universities can nominate. Across disciplines, will stick together on a project of 5 years. They will be at home, facilitated like in the Marie Curie to travel between, for example, Oxford, if it was Oxford and Harvard. But there will be every year 4 months at IIASA, 5 years long, to work on a projects which are connected to the major integrated modeling transition. So this is the next step in the putting the education outreach, if you like, new generation in place. The other example is to communication. When Indonesia joined and I went to Jakarta to meet them, I was invited for a Saturday workshop to give a lecture to government. I said, well, probably nobody will come. Now, Indonesia, they have a presidential unit of Mr. Kuntoro, who is professor himself. And actually, he has a mandate to collect once a month all the ministers from all the departments, can you believe it? And they listen whole day to discussions. So I could give a lecture there to the kind of trans-sectoral ministerial meeting. And actually, I found it so interesting and so enthusiastic happenings that we are going to start similar type of, well, layback summer course week for the high level of senior official government from IIASA counties to come to Luxembourg in a layback question actually to discuss that. So there are these new elements coming into it. It's a phase of building of a number of new initiatives. Last but not least, in terms of rewarding transdisciplinary science, I think many questions were about, are we able to teach? Are we able to tell it? I think we are. If you look around, every one of you actually made a comment which is worth of recording, and actually, I think the problem is on the other side too. The system of scientific rewarding is too rigid. The system of the agencies is too rigid. We are talking to NSF. I've been talking to NERC. I mean, before my IIASA life, I know everybody at NERC. I mean, so it's difficult to get something across disciplinary. So it's not only on the side of ABLE, it's out of the system itself. So I think our challenge could be, because we are professional scientists, try to get it changed, instigated first there. It must be possible to get Belmont Forum is meeting as we speak in India this week, trying to put agencies together, to put up a call. We were hoping 500 million will be 10 million only. So problem is also there. We are scaring people off before they start, because they cannot publish, they cannot get a grant because of such grants are simply too scarce. So I would like also to point, if I may, my finger on the other side of the edge.
Chris. Yeah, I'd just like to follow up that remark about the reward system. I was talking to a young lady from Princeton the other day who's published very broadly. So I can't get tenure in the chemistry department because I'm not publishing just in mainstream chemistry. Not enough publications. So the universities have not got the reward system right here. Quite how we get it right, I don't know. On the communities, obviously we should have had a medic here. We did talk about pandemics and so on. There's probably one too many physicists, me, on this panel, actually. There's two of us. But lawyers, vital, of course, but at all levels, from sort of IPCC negotiations, European law, right down to local planning and all these things. So clearly all these disciplines have to come in. But I think another question is how to get other communities in. Now, Jim referred to this meeting we had in Oxford with a lot of major companies and so on. It was quite an interesting meeting. Whether the messages will stick, I don't know, but I wanted to say one of the things that's encouraging is there are a lot of people at the top of business who are at least talking the talk. Enlightened CEOs. I don't know about lower down, and it's not all businesses, but it's the young folk and some of the CEOs are talking the talk, and that's got to be good, I think. Just a final point. Pavel said he'd come back to the UK and IIASA, but he didn't, so maybe I will. The UK left in a huff when the Americans left, when Ronald Reagan announced it was a nest of spies, and the UK followed out of IIASA, but it was always supposed to be temporary. The US went back, and the UK somehow forgot to go back. We're talking about a trivial sum of money. And anything here anybody can do to persuade our government to get back into IIASA, please do it.
Okay. Yes. Last word from Jill.
Oh, and I'm the one between you and the drinks, right?
Yes.
So I just wanted to pick up, I mean, I really would underline this idea that the system itself needs to change, that we're not giving credit for the kinds of things that we see we need from a systems point of view, from an implementation point of view. But pick up on two other questions. Somebody asked, where's the neutrality? We're bringing value judgments into all this. Well, the minute we start talking about sustainability as a goal, sustainability is a normative goal. It's something that implicitly and explicitly involves values. And so we're going to have to change our ideas there. We're going to have to accept that even we as scientists are working with goals that include value judgments. However, if that's the case, that's why we need these processes of dialogue, and that's why we need to include all of the actors, all of the professional communities in the discussion. Because of that normativity, because there are value judgments, because there are inevitably going to be trade-offs, which then leads to the question, so what kinds of skills do we need? We need the skills of people who can set those dialogues up, keep them going, moderate the discussion so that there is a process of finding commonalities, of understanding and of social learning. Those are the skills that we need exactly because the sustainability goal is a tricky one and it can't be neutral.
Thank you very much. Well, before we adjourn, let me just say this has been a very stimulating and wide-ranging discussion. I'm sorry we couldn't get a bigger room here at the Royal Society with more people who would like to come, but it's a meeting of 300 people discussing open access in journals. in the other room, and I think this is rather more exciting and wide-ranging than that. I think we'd all like to thank the speakers. But I'd particularly like to thank Dr. Kabat for coming, and for Sebastian Cody and the others from IIASA for organising this meeting. So thank you very much, and we have an hour to continue the discussion over drinks just outside. So thank you very much to everyone for coming. Thank you.